Have you ever wondered what life was truly like behind medieval Russia's frozen palace walls? Beyond fairy tales lay a world where fierce princes and mystical traditions shaped destiny through long centuries. Epic family struggles forged this great nation. Triumph and tragedy marked every royal generation. Tonight, as you drift toward peaceful sleep, we'll journey through history together. Close your eyes and discover the intimate human stories behind the crown. The land of rivers and forests. Picture a land where winter held dominion for half the year. Endless forests stretched beyond imagination, broken only by mighty rivers that flowed like silver highways through the darkness. This was the world where Russian civilization began. Snow fell silently on wooden villages scattered across a landscape so vast it seemed to touch the very edges of eternity. The early Slavs who called this harsh paradise home lived simply. Their log houses hugged the riverbanks, smoke rising from clay chimneys into skies that promised either abundance or starvation. These people understood that survival meant community. Families gathered around central hearths, sharing warmth, stories, and the precious resources that sustained them through months of bitter cold. In these settlements, life revolved around the seasons. Spring brought the ice breakup that reconnected isolated communities. Summer meant frantic preparation, gathering, hunting, harvesting everything possible before winter's return. Autumn was celebration time, when marriages were arranged and festivals honoured the old gods who controlled their fate. The Slavs worshipped forces they could see and feel. Thunder gods commanded storms that could destroy crops or fill their rivers. Forest spirits protected or punished hunters who entered the deep woods. Fire goddesses lived in every hearth, keeping families alive through the long nights. Every stream, every grove, every sacred stone held power that demanded respect. But these scattered tribes were not alone in their vast wilderness. Through their territories flowed something that would change everything, the great trade route connecting Scandinavia to Byzantium. Vikings called it the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Local Slavic tribes knew it as their lifeline to the wider world. Picture merchant ships loaded with amber, furs and honey, heading south toward Constantinople's golden markets. Northbound vessels carried silk, spices and silver that would transform humble Slavic villages into trading posts. The Dnieper River became a highway of dreams, carrying wealth and ambition through the heart of what would become Russia. Along this route, something magical began happening. Viking traders didn't just pass through, they settled. Slavic chiefs didn't just trade, they adopted new customs. Wooden fortresses rose at strategic river bends, protecting both merchants and local families. These fortified settlements became the first Russian cities. The rivers themselves were lifelines in ways modern people can barely comprehend. The Volga, Dnieper and Dniester weren't just watercourses. They were highways, defensive barriers and sources of life itself. In winter, frozen rivers became roads for sleds carrying goods between distant communities. In summer, swift currents powered the boats that connected this emerging civilization. River settlements followed ancient patterns. Houses clustered near the water, but high enough to escape spring floods. Each family built their wooden home with skills passed down through generations. Logs were fitted so precisely that no nails were needed. Steep roofs shed heavy snow loads. Small windows conserved heat while letting in precious daylight during the brief winter days. Inside these homes, life centered around the sacred hearth. Here, families cooked meals, crafted tools, and shared the stories that preserved their history. Children learned their culture sitting beside these fires, listening to tales of heroes, spirits, and ancestors who walked these same forests long ago. Grandparents spoke of times when different tribes fought over hunting grounds and river crossings. Women managed the household with skills that meant the difference between life and death. They preserved fish and meat, dried berries and mushrooms, brewed honey wine that warmed long winter nights. Men hunted, trapped, and traded. But women's knowledge of food preservation, herbal medicine, and textile production kept families alive year after year. The forest provided everything these early people needed if they knew its secrets. Birch bark became writing material and waterproof containers. Pine resin sealed boats and preserved food. Oak bark tanned leather for clothing and boots. Every tree species offered specific gifts to those who understood their properties. Community decisions were made at gatherings called vesh, assemblies where free men debated issues affecting their settlement. These weren't formal governments, but traditions rooted in the belief that survival required cooperation. Disputes were settled by elders who knew both tribal law and the practical needs of community life. Marriage customs reflected the harsh realities of frontier existence. Families negotiated alliances that strengthened their position in trade networks or military situations. Wedding celebrations lasted for days, cementing bonds between not just couples but entire extended families. Children were treasured because population was survival. More hands meant better chances against nature's challenges. Death rituals honored ancestors while acknowledging life's fragility. The Slavs buried their dead with personal possessions, believing souls needed familiar objects in the afterlife. Burial mounds dotted the landscape, marking territories and commemorating leaders whose stories lived on in tribal memory. Trade transformed everything gradually but inevitably. Silver coins from distant empires began appearing in household treasures. Silk ribbons adorned traditional clothing. Spices flavored foods that had been bland for centuries. Local craftsmen learned new techniques from foreign merchants, creating hybrid styles that blended Slavic traditions with international influences. The most valuable trade goods came from the land itself. Honey from wild bees commanded high prices in southern markets. Furs from sable, marten and fox were prized by Byzantine nobility. Amber from Baltic shores was worked into jewellery and religious artefacts. These natural treasures gave Slavic traders bargaining power with sophisticated civilizations. As trade networks expanded, some settlements grew into proto-cities. Novgorod emerged as a major trading centre where merchants from many nations gathered. Kiev became a fortress controlling Dnieper river traffic. These places attracted ambitious individuals who saw opportunities beyond traditional tribal life. The transformation wasn't uniform or peaceful. Some tribes embraced change eagerly, welcoming foreign traders and adopting new customs. Others resisted, viewing outside influence as threats to ancestral ways. Conflicts erupted between communities that chose different paths, creating the first political divisions in Russian history. Leadership began changing as trade brought new forms of wealth and power. Traditional clan chiefs found themselves competing with merchant princes who controlled river routes. Military prowess remained important, but commercial success increasingly determined a community's influence and survival prospects. This was the world that would soon welcome the Varangians, a land of endless forests, mighty rivers, and hardy people who had learned to thrive in one of Earth's most challenging environments. They possessed the survival skills, trading networks, and cultural foundations that would support the great civilization about to emerge from their humble wooden settlements. The stage was set for the arrival of the legendary Rurik. The coming of Rurik. The year was 862 and chaos gripped the northern lands. Tribal wars had torn apart the delicate balance that kept Slavic communities alive. Brother fought brother over river crossings and trading rights. No one trusted their neighbours. Merchants feared travelling the routes that once brought prosperity to all. In their desperation, the tribal leaders made a decision that would echo through centuries. They gathered in council, grey-bearded chiefs who had watched their world crumble. "Our land is vast and rich," they declared, "but there is no order among us." Their solution seemed impossible: invite foreign rulers to govern them. The messengers they sent northward carried a message that has puzzled historians ever since. Come and rule over us. Whether this legendary invitation truly happened exactly as chroniclers recorded, or whether it simplified a more complex series of events, we may never know. But Rurik came, and with him came the dynasty that would rule Russia for 7 centuries. Picture Rurik himself, a Varangian chieftain whose very name meant famous ruler in the Norse tongue. He wasn't the savage raider that Byzantine chronicles described. Archaeological evidence suggests he was a sophisticated trader warrior, someone who understood both commerce and combat. His ships carried not just weapons, but luxury goods, diplomatic gifts, and the administrative knowledge that chaotic Slavic territories desperately needed. When Rurik's longships appeared on Lake Ilmen, the people of Novgorod saw more than foreign warriors. They saw salvation from the endless conflicts that had brought their communities to the brink of collapse. Here was a man with no local tribal loyalties, someone who could impose order without favouring one clan over another. Rurik established his court in Novgorod with surprising sensitivity to local customs. Rather than sweeping away Slavic traditions, he blended them with Scandinavian practices. The traditional Vetch assemblies continued, but now under his ultimate authority. Local chiefs retained their positions, but reported to his representatives. This wasn't conquest in the brutal sense. It was a sophisticated merger of cultures. Behind the legends lay human stories of adaptation and survival. Rurik's warriors didn't just arrive as conquerors. Many married into local families. Their children grew up speaking both Norse and Slavonic languages. These mixed marriages created the first generation of Russo-Scandinavian nobility, people who understood both cultures and could navigate between them. Family life in Rurik's early court reflected this cultural fusion. His own household included both Varangian retainers and Slavic advisors. Meals featured traditional northern fish dishes alongside Slavic grain porridge. Evening entertainment mixed Norse sagas with local folk tales. Children played games that combined elements from both traditions. The physical transformation of Novgorod revealed how Viking organizational skills enhanced Slavic craftsmanship. New defensive works surrounded the settlement, but they incorporated local building techniques using available materials. The prince's hall grew larger and more elaborate, but it remained fundamentally a wooden structure built by Slavic carpenters who had perfected their craft over generations. Rurik's court operated differently from traditional Slavic leadership. Where tribal chiefs had ruled through consensus and custom, Rurik established more formal hierarchies. He appointed trusted men to govern distant territories. Regular tribute collection replaced the informal gift-giving that had supported earlier leaders. These changes brought stability, but also introduced concepts of centralized authority that were foreign to Slavic political traditions. Daily routines in the early Rurikid court blended practical governance with ceremonial displays of power. Mornings began with military exercises that kept the prince's retinue battle-ready. Afternoons were devoted to hearing disputes, planning trade expeditions, and meeting with representatives from subordinate communities. Evenings featured formal feasts where loyalty was reinforced through shared meals and ritual drinking. The succession question haunted Rurik's later years. Unlike Slavic customs where leadership often passed through complex clan arrangements, Rurik wanted to establish clear dynastic succession. His young son Igor was too small to rule when Rurik died around 879. This created the succession crisis that would bring Oleg to power and forever change the destiny of the Russian lands. Rurik's legacy wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. His descendants carried both Scandinavian names and Slavic customs. They spoke multiple languages and understood diverse cultural traditions. This cultural flexibility would prove essential as they expanded their rule southward toward Kiev and eventually created one of medieval Europe's most powerful states. The transformation from tribal chaos to dynastic rule happened gradually in most territories. Local chiefs retained authority over day-to-day affairs while acknowledging Rurik's supreme leadership. Trade routes reopened as merchants gained confidence in the new security arrangements. Tribute flowed northward while protection and administrative services flowed back to subordinate communities. Women played crucial but often hidden roles in this cultural transition. Scandinavian women brought different legal traditions and social expectations to their marriages with Slavic men. Slavic women who married into Varangian families introduced their husbands to local customs, foods, and religious practices. These personal relationships created the cultural bridges that made political unity possible. Children growing up in this mixed environment developed identities that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries. They were equally comfortable in trading posts and military camps, Orthodox churches and pagan sacred groves. This generation would provide the leadership for the next phase of Russian expansion under Oleg's guidance. Religious practices during Rurik's reign reflected the theological complexity of the cultural merger. Scandinavian gods like Thor and Odin received offerings alongside Slavic deities. Sacred sites included both traditional Slavic holy groves and newly constructed Scandinavian ritual centres. This religious tolerance created space for the Christian influences that would eventually transform Russian spiritual life completely. Oleg the Prophet and the birth of Kievan Rus. When young Prince Igor inherited his father Rurik's throne, he was barely old enough to hold a sword. Real power passed to his kinsman Oleg, a man whose political vision and military genius would create the first unified Russian state. The Slavs called him Oleg the Prophet, because his strategic insights seemed almost supernatural. Oleg understood something that earlier rulers had missed. True power in this land of rivers lay not in the northern forests around Novgorod, but in controlling the great water highway that connected Scandinavia to Byzantium. Kiev sat at the crucial bend in the Dnieper River, where all north-south trade had to pass. Whoever controlled Kiev controlled the economic lifeline of Eastern Europe. The conquest of Kiev in 882 wasn't just a military campaign, it was a carefully orchestrated political drama. Oleg didn't storm the city walls like a simple raider. Instead, he used cunning that revealed deep understanding of human psychology and local politics. He approached Kiev disguised as a merchant, his warriors hidden in trading boats that appeared peaceful and profitable rather than threatening. Kiev's rulers Askold and Dir welcomed what they thought were wealthy northern traders. They came down to the riverbank expecting profitable negotiations. Only then did Oleg reveal his true identity and overwhelming force. "You are not princes or of princely birth," he declared, presenting young Igor, "but here is the son of Rurik." The psychological shock of this revelation left the Kiev rulers defenseless. They were killed before they could organize resistance. This bloodless coup transformed Eastern European politics overnight. Oleg now controlled both ends of the great trade route, Novgorod in the north and Kiev in the south. He immediately declared Kiev the mother of Russian cities, recognizing its strategic and symbolic importance. For the first time, someone had unified the scattered Slavic territories under single leadership. Palace life in early Kiev reflected Oleg's grand ambitions and practical wisdom. The wooden fortresses that protected the city were expanded and strengthened. But Oleg also focused on creating impressive ceremonial spaces. The Prince's Hall grew into a complex that could accommodate diplomatic missions from Byzantium, Bulgaria, and the Kazakh. Foreign ambassadors needed to see wealth and power that matched their own rulers' courts. Daily routines in Oleg's Kiev court balanced military readiness with commercial activity. Mornings began with weapons training for the prince's retinue. These weren't just Scandinavian warriors anymore. They included Slavic fighters, Finnic allies, and even reformed bandits who had joined the expanding state. Afternoons were devoted to trade negotiations, tribute collection, and the countless administrative details required to govern territories stretching from Lake Ladoga to the Black Sea steppes. The most audacious moment of Oleg's reign came in 907, when he decided to attack Constantinople itself. This wasn't mere raiding. It was a calculated diplomatic and military campaign designed to force the Byzantine Empire to acknowledge Russian power and grant favourable trading rights. The preparation revealed Oleg's sophisticated understanding of both logistics and psychology. Imagine the scene as Oleg's massive fleet prepared for this unprecedented expedition. 2,000 ships carrying 80,000 warriors represented the largest military force ever assembled in Russian territories. But Oleg wasn't relying on numbers alone. He understood that psychological warfare could achieve more than actual fighting. Personal accounts from Byzantine chronicles describe the terror that gripped Constantinople when Oleg's fleet appeared in the Bosphorus. But the most brilliant stroke was yet to come. When the Byzantines stretched a great chain across the harbour to prevent naval attack, Oleg ordered his ships dragged onto rollers and transported overland around the barrier. The sight of ships sailing across dry land convinced many defenders that they faced supernatural forces. The psychological impact was exactly what Oleg intended. Rather than endure a siege that might destroy their capital, the Byzantine emperors agreed to negotiate. The resulting treaty granted Russian merchants extraordinary privileges in Constantinople's markets. They could trade tax-free, receive food and lodging at imperial expense, and even use the imperial baths. No other foreign power enjoyed such favourable terms. Court ceremonies in Kiev evolved rapidly as Oleg's prestige grew. Byzantine diplomatic gifts introduced new luxury goods and artistic styles. The prince's regalia began incorporating elements that reflected his victories and international status. Formal feasts became elaborate affairs where diplomatic protocol mixed with traditional Slavic hospitality and Scandinavian warrior customs. Family life in the expanding royal household revealed the challenges of governing a multi-ethnic state. Young Prince Igor grew up surrounded by advisors who spoke different languages and followed various customs. His education included not just military training but diplomatic skills, commercial knowledge, and the cultural sensitivity needed to rule diverse populations effectively. Daily life for noble families in Kiev reflected the city's position as an international crossroads. Merchant caravans brought exotic goods that transformed aristocratic lifestyles. Silk clothing replaced traditional linen and wool garments. Spices enhanced foods that had been simply prepared for centuries. Wine from Byzantine vineyards competed with traditional honey wine at formal dinners. The blending of Viking and Slavic traditions created unique customs that would define Russian court life for centuries. Scandinavian concepts of personal loyalty to a war leader merged with Slavic traditions of community decision-making. The result was a system where princes commanded absolute loyalty in military and diplomatic matters, but consulted extensively with nobles and merchants on domestic issues. Women in Oleg's court navigated complex social expectations that reflected multiple cultural traditions. Scandinavian customs gave women more legal rights and social freedom than traditional Slavic practices, but Byzantine influence introduced new concepts of feminine roles and religious obligations. Noble ladies needed to understand all these expectations while managing households that included servants and retainers from many different backgrounds. Religious life during Oleg's reign remained officially pagan, but Christian influences grew stronger each year. Trade contacts with Byzantium brought Russian nobles into regular contact with Orthodox Christianity. Some began adopting Christian practices privately while maintaining pagan observances publicly. This religious flexibility would prove crucial when later rulers decided to officially convert the entire state. The administrative innovations that Oleg introduced laid foundations for centuries of Russian governance. He established the first systematic tribute collection system, appointed governors for distant territories, and created communication networks that kept Kiev informed about developments across the realm. These weren't just practical measures, they were the building blocks of centralized statehood. Oleg's death around 912 left behind more than territorial conquests. He had created the political and cultural framework that would allow his successors to build one of medieval Europe's most powerful states. His combination of military prowess, diplomatic cunning, and administrative skill established patterns that defined Russian leadership for generations. Igor and Olga love, loss, and revenge. Prince Igor finally took personal control of his inheritance when he reached maturity in 912. The young man who had been a symbolic figurehead during Oleg's regency now faced the immense challenge of maintaining the state that his guardian had created. Igor's reign would be marked by both triumph and tragedy, but it was his wife Olga who would prove to be one of medieval Russia's most formidable rulers. Igor's early years as prince revealed the constant pressures facing Russian rulers. Tribute-paying tribes tested each new leader, hoping to reduce their obligations or regain independence. The Drevlians, a powerful Slavic tribe living in the forests west of Kiev, proved particularly troublesome. They had submitted to Oleg's overwhelming force but viewed the younger Igor as someone they might manipulate or defy. Palace life during Igor's reign reflected the growing sophistication of Russian court culture. Byzantine influences continued expanding through trade contacts and diplomatic exchanges. The wooden halls of Kiev were decorated with silk hangings, silver vessels, and religious artifacts that demonstrated the prince's wealth and international connections. Foreign ambassadors found a court that rivaled those of more established European kingdoms. Igor's marriage to Olga represented both personal affection and political calculation. Olga came from Pskov, a northern city that controlled important trade routes. Her family had connections to both Scandinavian and Slavic nobility, but contemporary accounts suggest this was also a love match, rare in an era when royal marriages were typically arranged for purely political reasons. Behind the palace walls, Igor and Olga created a family life that balanced public duties with private happiness. Their son, Sviatoslav, became the centre of their personal world, even as political pressures demanded constant attention to state affairs. Palace tutors included both military instructors, who taught the young prince combat skills, and diplomatic advisors, who prepared him for the complex negotiations that defined Russian leadership. The Drevlian problem festered throughout Igor's reign. These forest dwellers had resources that Kiev needed: honey, furs, and agricultural products that supported the city's growing population. But they repeatedly challenged Igor's authority, testing whether he possessed his predecessor's combination of strength and cunning. Each confrontation weakened the delicate balance that held the expanding Russian state together. Igor's fatal mistake came in 945 during what should have been a routine tribute collection expedition. He had already gathered the required payments from Drevlian communities, but his retinue convinced him to return for additional wealth. "We are naked and poor," they complained, comparing themselves to the well-equipped followers of other nobles. Igor's decision to make a second tribute demand would cost him his life. The Drevlians interpreted this unprecedented second collection as evidence that Igor was weak and greedy rather than strong and just. Their leader Mal declared that if they submitted to this increased exploitation, Igor would continue demanding more until he had destroyed their communities entirely. They decided that killing Igor was preferable to gradual enslavement. Contemporary accounts of Igor's death reveal the brutal realities of medieval justice. The Drevlians bent 2 birch trees down to the ground, tied Igor between them, and then released the trees. The resulting execution was both symbolic and practical. It demonstrated their complete rejection of his authority while ensuring that no one could mistake their intentions. News of Igor's death reached Kiev like a thunderclap. Princess Olga found herself suddenly responsible for governing a vast state while protecting her 3-year-old son's inheritance. The Drevlians, emboldened by their success, immediately sent ambassadors to Kiev with an audacious proposal. Prince Mal wanted to marry Olga and become the new ruler of all Russian territories. Behind palace walls, Olga's initial reaction was probably a mixture of grief, rage, and calculation. Medieval sources focus on her famous revenge, but they hint at the complex emotions of a woman who had lost both her husband and her sense of security. She needed to demonstrate strength that would discourage other rebellious tribes, while somehow maintaining the loyalty of nobles who might be tempted to abandon a widowed princess and her infant son. Olga's response to the Drevlian marriage proposal became legendary for its cunning cruelty. She invited their ambassadors to stay in Kiev as honoured guests, promising to give them a formal answer the next day. That evening she ordered her servants to dig a deep pit in the palace courtyard. When morning came, she told the Drevlians that they would be carried to the palace in their boat, as befitted such important visitors. The 20 Drevlian ambassadors were lifted in their vessel by Kiev's citizens, who carried them in procession through the city streets. The crowd cheered as if celebrating a great victory. Only when they reached the palace courtyard did the ambassadors realize their danger. The boat was dumped into the prepared pit, and Olga's soldiers began shoveling earth on top of the trapped men. Legend says she asked if they found the honor to their liking before they suffocated beneath the soil. But Olga's revenge had only begun. She sent messengers to the Drevlian territories requesting that their most distinguished men come to Kiev to escort her properly to her wedding with Prince Mal. This second delegation included the most important nobles and warriors from the Drevlian tribe. When they arrived in Kiev, Olga offered them the traditional hospitality of a royal bathhouse to clean themselves before the ceremony. The wooden bathhouse was prepared with exceptional care, sealed tightly to hold heat and filled with the finest soaps and oils. Once the Drevlian nobles were inside enjoying their bath, Olga's servants barred the doors from outside and set the building on fire. The screams from within could be heard throughout Kiev as the most powerful members of the Drevlian leadership burned alive. Still not satisfied, Olga announced that she would personally visit the Drevlian lands to hold a funeral feast at Igor's grave before agreeing to the marriage. This apparent acceptance convinced the remaining Drevlians that their plan had succeeded despite the mysterious disappearance of their ambassadors. They prepared a great celebration to welcome their future princess. The funeral feast that Olga organized was magnificent by medieval standards. Hundreds of Drevlian warriors gathered to honor the dead prince while celebrating their victory over Kiev. Wine and honey flowed freely as the tribal leaders toasted their success and discussed plans for governing their expanded territories. Only when they were thoroughly drunk did Olga reveal her true intentions. Her concealed soldiers fell upon the intoxicated Drevlians without mercy. Contemporary chronicles claim that 5,000 men died that night, essentially the entire military leadership of the Drevlian tribe. The massacre was so complete that organized resistance became impossible. The survivors submitted unconditionally to Olga's authority. The following year's military campaign completed the Drevlian destruction. Olga personally led the army that besieged their remaining strongholds. The capital city of Iskorosten held out for months, but eventually fell to a ruse that demonstrated Olga's continuing tactical brilliance. She agreed to lift the siege in exchange for a token tribute of birds from each household, 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows per family. When the birds were delivered, Olga's soldiers attached burning tinder to their legs and released them. The birds naturally flew back to their nests in the city's wooden buildings. Iskorosten burned so completely that it was never rebuilt. The Drevlian tribe ceased to exist as an independent political entity. Palace life during Olga's regency reflected her unique position as both grieving widow and supreme ruler. She maintained the ceremonial aspects of queenship while exercising all the practical powers of kingship. Foreign diplomats found themselves negotiating with a woman who combined feminine grace with masculine ruthlessness. Her court became known throughout Europe for its wealth, sophistication, and the absolute loyalty of its nobles. Young Sviatoslav grew up in this environment of female authority and military excellence. His tutors included veterans of the Drevlian campaigns, who could teach both warfare and statecraft. But his mother remained his primary role model, a ruler who had proven that intelligence and determination could overcome any challenge. Olga's conversion to Christianity around 955 marked another crucial turning point in Russian history. Her pilgrimage to Constantinople brought her into direct contact with Byzantine imperial culture. Emperor Constantine VII received her with extraordinary honours, recognizing both her political importance and her personal achievements. The formal conversion ceremony in Hagia Sophia represented Russia's first official embrace of Orthodox Christianity. Behind the public ceremony lay personal motivations that chroniclers could only hint at. Perhaps Olga found in Christian teachings a spiritual framework that helped her process the grief and violence that had marked her rise to power. Perhaps she recognized that Christian conversion would strengthen diplomatic ties with Byzantium and Western Europe. Most likely her decision reflected both personal faith and political calculation. The transformation of palace life after Olga's conversion was gradual but significant. Christian festivals began supplementing traditional pagan celebrations. Orthodox priests joined the court as advisors and spiritual guides. Church construction projects demonstrated the ruler's commitment to her new faith, while providing employment for craftsmen and artists. Olga's attempts to convert her son Sviatoslav met with polite but firm resistance. The young prince understood that his warriors and nobles remained predominantly pagan. Converting to Christianity might undermine his military leadership and political authority. This religious disagreement created tension within the royal family that would persist throughout Sviatoslav's reign. The legacy of Olga's regency extended far beyond her famous revenge against the Drevlians. She established administrative systems that strengthened central government control over distant territories. Her diplomatic initiatives expanded Russian influence in both Byzantium and Western Europe. Most importantly, she demonstrated that effective leadership didn't depend on traditional masculine qualities alone. When Olga finally handed power to her adult son around 962, she had transformed both the Russian state and concepts of royal authority. Her example would inspire future generations of strong women who played crucial roles in Russian governance. The foundation she laid would support the expansion and consolidation that marked the height of Kievan power under her descendants. Vladimir the Great, the baptism of Rus. Sviatoslav's reign brought military glory but personal tragedy. This warrior prince spent his life conquering distant lands while his own family fractured into competing factions. When he died in battle around 972, his 3 sons immediately began fighting over their inheritance. The civil war that followed would determine whether Olga's carefully constructed state survived or collapsed into chaos. Vladimir was the youngest of these brothers, and initially the least likely to succeed. His older brothers Yaropolk and Oleg controlled the most important cities and commanded larger armies. But Vladimir possessed something his siblings lacked. Their grandmother Olga's combination of cunning intelligence and absolute ruthlessness. The civil war that seemed to favour his brothers ultimately became the crucible that forged one of history's greatest rulers. The young Vladimir, who emerged victorious from this fraternal bloodbath, bore little resemblance to the saint he would later become. Contemporary accounts describe a pagan prince whose appetites were legendary even by medieval standards. He maintained multiple wives, built temples to thunder gods and forest spirits, and celebrated victories with sacrificial rituals that horrified Christian observers. Palace life in Vladimir's early Kiev reflected these pagan excesses. The prince's wooden halls echoed with the sounds of perpetual feasting. Warriors who had followed him to victory expected rewards that included not just gold and land, but access to the luxuries that demonstrated their leader's power. Foreign merchants found a court where traditional Russian hospitality had evolved into elaborate displays of wealth and generosity. But beneath this surface of pagan celebration, Vladimir was quietly studying the religious and political systems of his neighbours. His grandmother's conversion to Christianity had demonstrated the diplomatic advantages of religious alignment with Byzantium. Trade relationships with Muslim merchants revealed the commercial benefits of Islamic connections. Jewish communities in his territories offered examples of how minority religions could coexist with majority populations. The famous story of Vladimir's choosing of religions has become legend, but the reality was probably more complex than chroniclers suggested. The prince didn't simply invite religious delegations to make presentations like some spiritual trade fair. Instead, he engaged in years of careful investigation, sending trusted advisors to study different religious systems in their home territories. Picture the intimate council meetings where Vladimir wrestled with this momentous decision. His inner circle included both pagan traditionalists who feared losing their ancestral customs, and practical politicians who recognized the advantages of religious conversion. These weren't formal theological debates, but deeply personal discussions about identity, loyalty, and the future of their civilization. The advisors Vladimir sent to study Islam returned with mixed reports. They admired the learning and sophistication they found in Muslim territories, but they couldn't accept religious restrictions on alcohol consumption. "Drinking is the joy of the Rus," they reportedly declared. "We cannot exist without that pleasure." The cultural gap between Islamic temperance and Russian drinking customs proved unbridgeable. Western Christianity received similar consideration and similar rejection. Vladimir's emissaries visited German territories and observed Catholic religious practices. They found impressive organization and beautiful ceremonies, but they also discovered political structures that subordinated local rulers to foreign religious authority. Vladimir had fought too hard for independence to voluntarily submit to papal oversight. The delegation that visited Constantinople returned with reports that changed everything. These hardened warriors, men who had seen palaces and treasures throughout the known world, were overwhelmed by what they witnessed in Hagia Sophia. "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth," they told Vladimir, "for on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty." But Vladimir's decision involved more than aesthetic appreciation. The Byzantine Empire offered political alliance, commercial advantages, and cultural sophistication that aligned with his ambitions for Kiev. Orthodox Christianity provided spiritual authority without foreign political control. The theological concept of symphony between church and state allowed secular rulers to maintain temporal power while gaining religious legitimacy. The negotiations that led to Vladimir's conversion revealed his continued mastery of diplomatic manipulation. Rather than simply requesting baptism and alliance, he created circumstances that made the Byzantine Empire desperate for his military assistance. Emperor Basil II faced a serious rebellion that threatened his throne. Vladimir offered 20,000 warriors to suppress this revolt, but only in exchange for marriage to the emperor's sister Anna Porphyrogenita. This marriage demand was unprecedented and shocking. Anna was born to the purple, a princess of the imperial bloodline who had never been promised to any foreign ruler, let alone a barbarian prince from the northern forests. But Basil's military situation was desperate enough that he agreed, contingent on Vladimir's conversion to Christianity and baptism. The personal drama behind this diplomatic triumph can only be imagined. Princess Anna faced the prospect of leaving Constantinople's sophisticated court for what she probably viewed as primitive exile among savage northerners. Her family arranged this marriage not from choice, but from political necessity. The emotional cost of such diplomatic sacrifices rarely appears in historical chronicles. Vladimir's baptism in Chersonesos around 988 marked the beginning of his personal transformation from pagan warrior to Christian prince. But the ceremony itself was probably less important than the months of religious instruction that preceded it. Orthodox theology provided intellectual frameworks that helped Vladimir understand his responsibilities as both ruler and believer. The marriage to Anna brought immediate changes to palace life in Kiev. The Byzantine princess arrived with a retinue that included priests, artists, architects, and craftsmen who would transform Russian court culture. Her personal chapel became the model for larger church construction projects. Her household customs influenced how the royal family observed religious festivals and daily devotions. Anna's adaptation to life in Kiev reveals the personal challenges of medieval diplomatic marriages. She had to learn new languages, adjust to different climate and cuisine, and navigate court relationships with people whose customs were foreign to her sophisticated Byzantine background. But she also brought knowledge and connections that elevated Kiev's international status. The mass baptism of Kiev in 988 became one of medieval history's most dramatic religious spectacles. Vladimir ordered all citizens to gather at the Dnieper River for simultaneous conversion. Pagan idols were destroyed in the elaborate public ceremonies. The wooden statue of Perun, the thunder god, was beaten with sticks and dragged through the streets before being thrown into the river. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes that mixed religious solemnity with human drama. Families gathered in the river waters uncertain what this ceremony meant for their daily lives. Children cried at the unfamiliar rituals. Elderly people who had worshipped forest spirits and household gods for decades wondered whether they were betraying ancestors or embracing salvation. The practical logistics of converting an entire city overnight required careful planning that chronicles rarely describe. Hundreds of priests were needed to perform baptisms and explain Christian beliefs to largely illiterate populations. Food and clothing had to be provided for crowds that spent entire days in religious ceremonies. Security forces maintained order while traditional religious authorities were displaced. Palace life after Christianization evolved gradually but profoundly. Morning prayers became routine parts of daily schedules. Christian festivals replaced pagan seasonal celebrations. The Prince's Hall was redesigned to accommodate orthodox religious ceremonies and visiting church hierarchs. Foreign diplomats found a court that now shared their religious vocabulary and ceremonial expectations. The architectural transformation of Kiev reflected Vladimir's commitment to his new faith. Wooden pagan temples gave way to stone churches built by craftsmen trained in Byzantine techniques. The Church of the Tithes, begun around 989, demonstrated both religious devotion and political ambition. This massive construction project employed hundreds of workers and displayed wealth that impressed foreign visitors. Family relationships within the royal household adapted to Christian moral expectations with varying degrees of success. Vladimir dismissed most of his multiple wives, maintaining only his marriage to Anna. His sons received Christian names alongside their traditional Slavic ones. Court entertainments evolved from pagan festivals focused on warfare and fertility to Christian celebrations emphasizing charity and spiritual devotion. Daily prayers became central to palace routines in ways that affected everyone from the prince to the lowest servants. Orthodox Christianity's elaborate calendar of festivals, fasts, and feast days restructured how the royal household organized time. religious obligations competed with military and administrative duties for the ruler's attention. The education of Vladimir's children reflected the new religious priorities. Prince Boris and Prince Gleb received instruction in Christian theology, alongside traditional training in warfare and statecraft. Their tutors included both Orthodox priests who taught religious doctrine and secular advisors who prepared them for political leadership. This combination created a generation of rulers who understood both spiritual and temporal authority. Vladimir's personal transformation from pagan warrior to Christian prince wasn't immediate or complete. Old habits and traditional customs persisted alongside new religious practices. The prince who had once sacrificed prisoners to thunder gods now built hospitals and fed the poor, but he also continued leading military campaigns that involved considerable violence. The conversion's impact extended throughout Russian society in ways that took generations to fully develop. Christian marriage customs gradually replaced traditional practices. Orthodox festivals slowly supplanted pagan seasonal celebrations. Church courts began handling disputes previously settled by tribal law. These changes created tensions between old and new customs that persisted for centuries. Foreign relations improved dramatically as Christian conversion opened diplomatic doors previously closed to pagan rulers. European princes now viewed Vladimir as a potential ally rather than a barbarian threat. Trade relationships expanded as Christian merchants felt more comfortable conducting business in Orthodox territories. Cultural exchanges brought new knowledge and artistic influences to Kiev. The Church of the Tithes became the symbol of Kiev's transformation and Vladimir's legacy. This magnificent stone structure, decorated with mosaics and frescoes created by Byzantine artists, demonstrated that Russian civilization had achieved equality with the most sophisticated cultures of its era. The church also housed Vladimir's tomb, marking his evolution from pagan conqueror to Christian saint. Royal court life in medieval Kiev. Dawn came early to the royal palace during Kiev's golden age. Prince Vladimir's household awakened to the sound of church bells calling the faithful to morning prayers. The transformation from pagan customs to Christian routines had reshaped every aspect of daily life within the palace walls. The prince himself began each day in his private chapel, a small but richly decorated space that reflected Byzantine artistic influences. Here, surrounded by golden icons and flickering candles, Vladimir fulfilled the religious obligations that had become central to his identity as a Christian ruler. These morning devotions weren't merely ceremonial, they provided spiritual preparation for the complex decisions that awaited him each day. Palace architecture during this golden period blended traditional Russian building techniques with Byzantine innovations that Princess Anna had introduced. The wooden halls that had served earlier rulers were gradually replaced by stone structures that could support elaborate decorative programs. Skilled craftsmen from Constantinople worked alongside local artisans, creating architectural styles uniquely suited to Kiev's climate and cultural traditions. The Great Hall where the prince held court reflected this architectural evolution. Massive wooden beams supported a roof high enough to accommodate hundreds of visitors during formal ceremonies, but the walls now featured stone foundations that could bear the weight of elaborate frescoes depicting biblical scenes and royal portraits. These decorations served both aesthetic and political purposes, demonstrating the ruler's wealth, while educating largely illiterate audiences about Christian teachings. A typical day in Vladimir's court began with private audiences for the most important nobles and foreign ambassadors. These morning meetings took place in smaller chambers where confidential discussions could proceed without interruption. The prince received reports from governors controlling distant territories, reviewed tribute collections, and made decisions about military campaigns or diplomatic initiatives. Court ceremonies during this period combined traditional Slavic customs with Byzantine protocols that elevated Kiev's international prestige. Foreign visitors found elaborate rituals that rivaled those of Constantinople or Western European capitals. The prince's regalia included both ancestral weapons that connected him to Rurik's dynasty and religious symbols that demonstrated his Christian authority. Family breakfast provided rare moments of privacy in lives dominated by public responsibilities. Vladimir's children gathered in the royal quarters to share meals that featured both traditional Russian foods and exotic delicacies imported through expanding trade networks. These intimate family moments offered opportunities for informal education, as the prince discussed current events and political strategies with his sons and daughters. The royal kitchen operated as a complex organization that reflected both hospitality traditions and security concerns. Master cooks supervised staffs that included specialists in different regional cuisines. Food preparation required careful attention to orthodox fasting requirements that regulated what could be served during different seasons. Palace feasts could feed hundreds of guests, requiring logistical planning that rivaled military campaigns. Afternoon activities varied depending on seasonal demands and political circumstances. During peaceful periods, the prince might spend hours in the palace library, a collection that had grown dramatically since Princess Anna's arrival. Greek texts on theology, philosophy, and statecraft were translated into Church Slavonic, creating the foundation for Russian intellectual life. Vladimir's own education continued throughout his reign as he absorbed knowledge that helped him govern more effectively. Court entertainment evolved significantly from the pagan revelries of earlier periods. Christian festivals provided occasions for celebrations that combined religious observance with royal display. Musicians performed both traditional Slavic songs and Byzantine hymns that required different vocal techniques and instrumental accompaniments. These cultural fusions created artistic traditions that would influence Russian music for centuries. The royal stable housed horses that demonstrated both practical necessity and symbolic importance. These weren't merely transportation, they were status symbols that reflected the prince's wealth and military capabilities. Foreign visitors judged rulers partly by the quality of their horses and the skill of their riders. Palace ceremonies often included elaborate equestrian displays that combined entertainment with demonstrations of military readiness. Marriage negotiations occupied significant portions of court life, as Vladimir arranged unions that would strengthen his dynasty's political position. These discussions involved complex calculations about dowries, territorial agreements, and diplomatic advantages. Royal children understood from early ages that their marriages would serve state interests rather than personal preferences, though chronicles occasionally hint at genuine affection between spouses. Women in Vladimir's court navigated expectations that reflected both traditional Slavic customs and Byzantine influences that Princess Anna had introduced. Noble ladies managed extensive household staffs while participating in religious ceremonies that provided some public visibility. Their education included domestic skills, religious knowledge, and the diplomatic abilities needed to represent their families in ceremonial contexts. Evening meals became elaborate social occasions that combined dining with diplomacy. The Great Hall accommodated hundreds of guests during formal banquets that could last for hours. Seating arrangements reflected complex hierarchies that acknowledged both noble rank and current political favour. These gatherings provided opportunities for the prince to reward loyal service while displaying wealth that impressed foreign ambassadors. Palace entertainment during evening gatherings included both traditional storytelling and new forms of Christian-influenced performance. Professional musicians performed epic songs about ancient heroes, alongside hymns praising contemporary religious figures. Acrobats, jesters, and dancers provided diversions that balanced sacred and secular elements, appropriate to a Christian court that retained appreciation for traditional customs. The prince's private quarters reflected the personal side of royal life that chronicles rarely described. Here, Vladimir could relax with his family away from the constant ceremonial demands of public leadership. Private chambers were decorated with personal treasures, family portraits, and religious artifacts that revealed individual tastes and spiritual commitments. Children's education in the royal household prepared them for leadership roles, while acknowledging that only one son could inherit supreme authority. Tutors included both military instructors who taught combat skills and scholarly priests who provided education in languages, theology, and statecraft. Young princes learned to ride, fight, read, write, and navigate the complex social relationships that defined medieval nobility. Seasonal celebrations provided structure for court life throughout the year. Christian festivals like Easter and Christmas became major events that combined religious observance with political display. These celebrations required months of preparation, and could last for weeks, providing employment for craftsmen, entertainment for nobles, and opportunities for the prince to demonstrate generous hospitality. The royal treasury reflected Kiev's prosperity during this golden age. Tribute from subordinate territories, profits from international trade, and diplomatic gifts created wealth that supported both military campaigns and cultural projects. The prince's treasure rooms contained gold, silver, precious gems, exotic furs, and religious artifacts that represented both economic resources and political capital. Palace security operated as a sophisticated system that protected both the royal family and the valuable treasures housed within the complex. Guards included both elite warriors from the prince's personal retinue and intelligence agents who monitored potential threats from both domestic and foreign sources. These security arrangements were necessarily discreet, as obvious defensive measures might suggest weakness or fear. Medical care within the palace reflected both traditional healing practices and knowledge introduced through Christian missionary activities. Court physicians included both local healers who understood regional diseases and treatments, and foreign specialists trained in Byzantine or other sophisticated medical traditions. The royal family's health remained a state secret that could affect political stability. Legal proceedings involving the royal household required careful balance between traditional Slavic customs, Christian moral teachings, and practical political considerations. The prince served as ultimate judge in disputes affecting his courtiers, but his decisions needed to acknowledge multiple legal traditions while maintaining consistency that would preserve his authority. Communication systems connected the Kiev palace with territories throughout the expanding Russian state. Messengers carried news, orders, and diplomatic correspondence across vast distances using relay stations that provided fresh horses and secure accommodation. These communication networks enabled centralized governance while providing early warning about potential military or political threats. Yaroslav the Wise and the height of power. The succession crisis that followed Vladimir's death in 1015 nearly destroyed everything the great prince had built. His sons turned against each other in a civil war that lasted 4 years and claimed the lives of several promising young rulers. When Prince Yaroslav finally emerged victorious in 1019, he inherited a kingdom bloodied by fraternal conflict, but positioned to achieve unprecedented heights of power and cultural achievement. Yaroslav brought to the throne a combination of military prowess and intellectual curiosity that would define his 35-year reign. Unlike his father Vladimir, who had converted to Christianity as an adult, Yaroslav had grown up within the Orthodox faith. This religious foundation shaped his approach to governance in ways that transformed not just Kiev, but the entire concept of Christian kingship in Eastern Europe. The prince's daily routine reflected his multifaceted interests and responsibilities. Morning prayers in the palace chapel were followed by audiences with foreign ambassadors, meetings with church hierarchs, and consultations with legal scholars working on his great law code. Afternoons might be devoted to military planning, architectural projects, or sessions in the royal library where he personally participated in translating Greek texts into Church Slavonic. Behind the scenes of medieval lawmaking lay years of careful investigation and consultation that chronicles rarely describe in detail. Yaroslav's legal scholars studied not just traditional Slavic customs, but also Byzantine civil law, church canon law, and the legal systems of neighboring peoples. The resulting code, known as the Russkaya Pravda, represented a sophisticated attempt to balance competing legal traditions while establishing consistent principles for governing a diverse population. The intimate process of creating these laws involved lengthy discussions in the palace council chamber. Yaroslav personally presided over debates between boyars who favoured traditional customs, church leaders who advocated Christian moral principles, and practical administrators who needed workable solutions for common legal problems. These sessions revealed the prince's diplomatic skills as he forged consensus among competing viewpoints. Legal provisions dealing with family relationships reflected the complex social changes that Christian conversion had introduced. Traditional Slavic customs regarding marriage, inheritance, and women's rights were modified to accommodate Orthodox teachings, while acknowledging practical realities of medieval life. These compromises created legal frameworks that would influence Russian society for centuries. The international marriages that Yaroslav arranged for his children represented perhaps his greatest diplomatic achievement. No previous Russian ruler had successfully negotiated matrimonial alliances with so many prominent European royal families. These marriages required years of preliminary negotiations involving dowries, territorial agreements, and religious accommodations that tested the skills of medieval diplomats. Princess Anna Yaroslavna's marriage to King Henry I of France in 1051 illustrated both the opportunities and challenges of these international unions. The young Russian princess found herself in a court that was less sophisticated than Kiev in many respects. French nobles were impressed by her literacy and education, qualities that were rarer among Western European women than among their Byzantine-influenced Russian counterparts. Behind palace walls, Yaroslav's family life revealed the personal costs of political greatness. The prince's multiple marriages produced children whose relationships were complicated by succession politics and competing maternal loyalties. Royal siblings grew up knowing that their personal happiness would always be subordinated to dynastic necessities that their father deemed essential for state security. The palace library became Yaroslav's most personal project and lasting legacy. This collection eventually included hundreds of Greek manuscripts that were painstakingly copied and translated by scholarly monks working under royal patronage. The prince himself participated in this intellectual labour, demonstrating unusual scholarly interest for a medieval warrior king. Daily life in the royal scriptorium revealed the slow, meticulous process by which ancient knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Monk scholars worked by candlelight, carefully copying theological texts, historical chronicles, and legal documents that would educate future generations of Russian leaders. Each manuscript represented months of patient labour and significant financial investment. The educational system that Yaroslav established for his children and other noble families laid foundations for Russian intellectual culture that persisted for centuries. Palace tutors included both Orthodox priests trained in Constantinople and secular scholars familiar with classical learning. Young nobles learned to read Greek, Latin, and Church Slavonic, giving them access to knowledge that was unavailable to most medieval rulers. Court ceremonies during Yaroslav's reign reached unprecedented levels of sophistication and international recognition. Foreign ambassadors found rituals that combined Byzantine imperial protocols with distinctively Russian elements that reflected the kingdom's unique cultural synthesis. These elaborate displays served diplomatic purposes while reinforcing the prince's authority among his own nobles. The construction projects initiated during this golden age transformed Kiev into one of medieval Europe's most impressive cities. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, begun around 1037, rivaled Constantinople's great church in architectural ambition and artistic achievement. This massive building project employed hundreds of craftsmen and demonstrated Kiev's wealth and cultural aspirations to the entire Christian world. Personal letters and chronicle accounts provide glimpses into the royal family's private relationships during this prosperous period. Yaroslav's correspondence with foreign rulers reveals a sophisticated diplomat who understood both international politics and human psychology. His domestic letters show a father concerned about his children's education, health, and spiritual development. Family celebrations during Yaroslav's reign combined religious observance with royal display in ways that strengthened both dynastic prestige and Christian devotion. Easter and Christmas festivities lasted for days, providing opportunities for the prince to reward loyal service while demonstrating generous hospitality. These celebrations required elaborate planning and significant financial resources. The role of women in Yaroslav's court reflected both Byzantine influences and traditional Slavic customs that granted noble ladies considerable informal authority. The prince's wives and daughters participated in charitable activities, religious ceremonies, and informal diplomatic functions that were essential to maintaining the complex relationships that supported royal authority. Palace intrigue during the Golden Age remained relatively restrained compared to the violent succession crises that had marked earlier periods. Yaroslav's success in managing competing noble factions reflected both his political skills and the prosperity that provided rewards for loyal service. However, tensions persisted beneath the surface harmony that chronicles celebrated. The prince's military campaigns during this period were carefully calculated to expand Russian influence, while avoiding conflicts that might destabilize the international balance he had worked so hard to achieve. Victories against nomadic tribes on the southern steppes secured trade routes while demonstrating continued military capabilities to both allies and potential enemies. Cultural achievements during Yaroslav's reign extended far beyond legal codes and architectural projects. Court poets created epic works that celebrated both Christian themes and traditional heroic values. Craftsmen developed distinctive artistic styles that combined Byzantine techniques with local traditions. These cultural innovations influenced Russian artistic development for generations. Religious life in the royal household reflected Yaroslav's deep personal piety, while acknowledging the political dimensions of Christian leadership. The prince's devotions included not just formal ceremonies, but private prayers and charitable activities that demonstrated genuine spiritual commitment. His religious foundations provided education and social services that benefited the entire kingdom. The administrative innovations that Yaroslav introduced created governmental structures capable of governing territories that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea steppes. These systems included regular tribute collection, communication networks, legal courts, and military organization that operated with unprecedented efficiency and consistency. Trade relationships flourished under Yaroslav's skillful diplomacy, bringing wealth that supported both military campaigns and cultural projects. Kiev became a crucial link between Scandinavia and Byzantium, while also developing commercial connections with Western Europe that enhanced the city's international importance. The beginning of decline. The golden age that Yaroslav the Wise had created contained the seeds of its own destruction. The great prince's decision to divide his realm among his 5 sons, intended to prevent the succession crises that had plagued earlier generations, instead created a system of competing principalities that would tear apart the unified state he had spent decades building. The testament that Yaroslav left upon his death in 1054 revealed both his political wisdom and his fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. Each son received a major city with its surrounding territories. Izyaslav got Kiev and supreme authority, Sviatoslav received Chernigov, Vsevolod took Preyaslavl, Vyacheslav got Smolensk, and Igor received Vladimir Volynsky. The prince hoped that this division would satisfy his children's ambitions while maintaining family unity under the eldest brother's nominal leadership. Behind palace walls, the reality proved far more complex and tragic than Yaroslav's careful planning had anticipated. The brothers who had grown up together, educated by the same tutors and shaped by the same Christian values, began viewing each other as rivals rather than partners. What had been family disagreements became political conflicts that would escalate into open warfare. Iziaslav's early years as senior prince revealed the practical difficulties of maintaining authority over brothers who controlled their own armies and treasuries. Traditional respect for the eldest son competed with the natural ambitions of capable men who possessed the resources to pursue independent policies. The system that was supposed to prevent civil war instead made it almost inevitable. The first serious crisis erupted in 1068 when a confederation of nomadic tribes called the Cumans launched a major raid into Russian territory. The 3 eldest brothers, Izyaslav, Sviatoslav, and Vsevolod, combined their forces to meet this threat but suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of the Alta River. This military disaster exposed the weaknesses of the new political system. Personal accounts of this campaign reveal how quickly family cooperation could collapse under pressure. Each brother commanded his own troops and made independent tactical decisions during the battle. Coordination problems that might have been resolved easily under unified command became fatal flaws when 3 separate armies tried to function as one force. The aftermath of the defeat brought even worse consequences than the battle itself. Kiev's population, terrified by reports of approaching nomadic raiders, demanded that Prince Izyaslav arm the common citizens to defend their city. When he refused, considering such measures dangerous to princely authority, the people rose in revolt and drove him from the throne. Palace life during this political crisis revealed the human cost of dynastic conflicts. Iziaslav's family fled Kiev in fear for their lives, abandoning treasures and personal possessions that represented decades of careful accumulation. The prince's wife and children experienced the psychological trauma of sudden exile from the palace that had been their secure home. Sviatoslav's decision to claim the Kievan throne for himself marked the point of no return in the fraternal relationship. Rather than supporting his brother's restoration, the Prince of Chernigov decided that Iziaslav's overthrow provided an opportunity to advance his own position. This betrayal transformed what might have been a temporary crisis into permanent family warfare. The personal letters that survive from this period provide heartbreaking glimpses into relationships destroyed by political ambition. Brothers who had once shared childhood adventures and family celebrations now wrote to each other as enemies. Traditional bonds of kinship proved weaker than the attractions of power and the fears that political competition generated. Court ceremonies during the succession crisis reflected the confusion and uncertainty that gripped the royal households. Foreign ambassadors found themselves uncertain about which prince had the authority to negotiate binding agreements. Nobles who had served the unified court now faced difficult choices about where to pledge their loyalties. The role of women in these political struggles remained largely hidden from chronicle accounts, but fragmentary evidence suggests that princesses and boyar wives played crucial behind-the-scenes roles. They maintained communication networks between hostile courts, preserved family treasures during military campaigns, and influenced their husbands' and sons' political decisions in ways that male chroniclers rarely acknowledged. Everyday life throughout the Russian territories suffered as the civil wars escalated. Trade routes became dangerous as competing princes' armies clashed along major highways. Tribute collection became irregular as local governors chose sides in the dynastic conflicts. The prosperity that had marked Yaroslav's reign gradually dissipated as resources were diverted from productive activities to military campaigns. The psychological impact on royal children who grew up during this period of family warfare would influence Russian politics for generations. Princes who witnessed their fathers' struggles against uncles and cousins learned to view family relationships as sources of threat rather than support. The next generation would prove even more ruthless in pursuing power and eliminating rivals. Palace intrigue during the civil wars reached levels of sophistication and brutality that exceeded anything from earlier periods. Assassination plots, midnight escapes, and betrayals by trusted advisors became commonplace features of court life. The paranoia that gripped royal households made effective governance increasingly difficult. Military campaigns between the competing princes devastated the countryside and weakened defences against external enemies. While Russian armies fought each other, nomadic tribes launched increasingly bold raids that penetrated deep into previously secure territories. The Cumans and other steppe peoples quickly learned to exploit Russian disunity for their own advantage. Foreign relations suffered as European courts lost confidence in Russian political stability. The international marriages that Yaroslav had negotiated so skillfully became sources of embarrassment when related princes fought each other. Diplomatic prestige that had taken decades to build was squandered in months of fraternal warfare. Religious authority also suffered during this period of political fragmentation. The church hierarchy found themselves caught between competing claims to legitimacy from princes who had been raised in the same Christian tradition. Bishops and abbots struggled to maintain neutrality while providing spiritual guidance to rulers whose conflicts undermined everything the church sought to achieve. The economic foundations of the Kievan state began eroding as civil wars disrupted the trade networks that had supported the Golden Age's prosperity. Merchants faced uncertainty about which prince controlled specific territories and what tribute obligations they owed to competing authorities. International commerce declined as foreign traders sought more stable business environments. Cultural achievements that had flourished under unified patronage suffered as resources were diverted to military purposes. Construction projects were abandoned when princes could no longer afford to support craftsmen and artists. The scholarly activities that had made Kiev a centre of learning declined as manuscripts were lost during military campaigns and libraries were neglected. The administrative systems that Yaroslav had created to govern his unified state proved inadequate for managing competing principalities with conflicting interests. Legal codes became less effective when different courts issued contradictory judgments. Communication networks designed to support central authority became tools for coordinating military campaigns against fellow Christians. Population movements during this period of instability began the demographic changes that would reshape Russian civilization. People fled from war zones toward more peaceful territories, concentrating in northern cities like Novgorod and Vladimir that remained relatively secure. These migrations shifted the balance of power away from Kiev toward regions that would later emerge as centers of Russian recovery. The legacy of Yaroslav's division would haunt Russian history for centuries. The principle of lateral succession that he established, where brothers inherited before sons, created permanent instability as each generation produced new claimants to senior authority. What had been intended as a solution to succession crises became the cause of far worse conflicts that ultimately destroyed the unified Kievan state. The coming of the Mongols. The Russian princes were so busy fighting each other that they barely noticed the strange reports coming from the eastern steppes. Merchants spoke of a new confederation of nomadic tribes led by someone called Genghis Khan. Refugees told stories of entire peoples swept away by armies that moved faster than the wind. Most princes dismissed these tales as exaggerations from frightened traders seeking to explain their poor profits. In 1223, the first concrete evidence of this eastern threat appeared along the Kalka River. Two mysterious generals named Jebe and Subutai had led 20,000 Mongol warriors on a reconnaissance mission that circled the entire Caspian Sea. They weren't planning conquest. They were gathering intelligence about lands their master might want to claim later. The initial encounter between Russian scouts and Mongol advance parties seemed almost casual. German tribesmen, fleeing westward from Mongol pressure, appealed to their sometime allies, the Russian princes, for protection against these eastern invaders. Prince Mstislav of Galicia and his fellow rulers saw an opportunity to demonstrate their military prowess against what they assumed were just another nomadic raiding party. Behind palace walls, the decision to march against the Mongols revealed the fatal overconfidence that had developed during generations of success against traditional steppe enemies. Russian princes had spent decades fighting Kumans, Pechenegs, and other nomadic peoples with tactics that relied on heavy cavalry charges and fortified positions. They assumed these new eastern warriors would fight the same way. The personal letters that survive from this period show princes more concerned about precedence and glory than about gathering intelligence about their enemy. Mstislav the Bold of Galicia worried that his cousins might claim credit for victories he expected to win easily. Prince Mstislav of Kiev fretted about maintaining his senior status among the coalition partners. No one seems to have asked careful questions about Mongol military capabilities. The Russian army that assembled near the Kalka River in May 1223 represented the flower of the southern principality's military strength. 80,000 warriors gathered under multiple banners, each prince commanding his own contingent according to his own tactical preferences. This force looked impressive, but it lacked the unified command structure that effective military operations required. Personal accounts from survivors describe the confusion that gripped the Russian camp from the beginning. Princes argued about strategy during councils that lasted for hours without reaching clear decisions. Each leader wanted to position his troops where they would receive maximum glory from expected victories. No one established clear chains of command or communication systems. The Battle of the Kalka River began with what seemed like encouraging signs for the Russian forces. Mongol advance units retreated when challenged by Russian cavalry charges, drawing the attackers deeper into the steppe. Prince Mstislav the Bold's forces pushed forward eagerly, believing they were winning a conventional victory against retreating nomads. The trap that generals Jebe and Subutai had prepared revealed military sophistication that caught the Russians completely unprepared. The retreating Mongol units suddenly wheeled around while fresh forces appeared from concealment on both flanks. Russian heavy cavalry, committed to frontal charges, found themselves surrounded by lighter, more maneuverable enemies who struck from multiple directions simultaneously. Contemporary chronicles struggle to convey the shock that gripped Russian warriors when they realized they faced something unprecedented. These weren't the disorganized tribal raids they had fought for generations. The Mongol army moved with precision that suggested professional military organization and tactical knowledge far superior to anything the Russians had encountered. The personal experience of individual warriors during the battle reveals the psychological impact of facing completely unfamiliar fighting methods. Russian knights trained for individual combat found themselves targeted by coordinated archery that could bring down horses and riders from distances their own weapons couldn't match. Traditional armor proved inadequate against Mongol arrows designed to penetrate the heaviest protection. Prince Mstislav of Kiev never engaged in the main battle. His forces remained on a hill overlooking the battlefield, surrounded by a wagon fortress that should have provided security. For 3 days they watched smoke rising from the steppe where their fellow Russians were being systematically destroyed. The psychological torment of witnessing this disaster without being able to help may have been worse than death in battle. The surrender negotiations that ended the siege revealed Mongol diplomatic practices that combined mercy with calculated terror. The Mongol commanders promised Prince Mstislav and his followers safe passage home in exchange for their submission. They swore by their sacred customs that no Russian blood would be shed if the defenders laid down their arms peacefully. The execution of the Russian princes after their surrender demonstrated the literal interpretation that Mongols placed on their promises. No Russian blood was indeed shed, because the captives were pressed to death under wooden planks, while Mongol officers feasted on top of their makeshift table. This horrific method of execution served notice that these Eastern warriors operated according to rules that Christian knights didn't understand. News of the Kalka River disaster reached the Russian principalities slowly and incompletely. Surviving warriors told conflicting stories about what had happened on the distant steppe. Some claimed the defeat resulted from tactical mistakes or princely quarrels. Others spoke in hushed tones about enemies who seemed to possess almost supernatural military capabilities. Palace life in Kiev and other major cities continued much as before, despite the shocking news from the south. Prince Yuri of Vladimir was more concerned about his ongoing conflicts with Novgorod than about distant steppe battles. Most rulers convinced themselves that the Mongol threat would disappear once these eastern warriors returned to their distant homeland. The few voices that warned about future Mongol invasions were dismissed as alarmists who didn't understand the strategic situation. Veterans who had survived the Kalka River battle found audiences reluctant to hear their accounts of Mongol military superiority. Russian princes preferred to believe that better leadership and coordination could prevent future disasters. Family life in the royal household showed little immediate change after the Kalka River defeat. Children continued their education in languages, military skills, and court etiquette, as if nothing had happened. Marriage negotiations proceeded according to traditional calculations about dowries and territorial advantages. The psychological adjustment to defeat would come later, when the full implications became clear. The Mongol withdrawal after their reconnaissance mission created false confidence that the eastern threat had passed permanently. Jibi and Subbutai's forces disappeared beyond the Urals as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind devastation that seemed like the aftermath of a natural disaster rather than a military campaign. Russian princes returned to their familiar civil wars, convinced they had witnessed an isolated raid rather than preliminary reconnaissance. Religious responses to the Kalka River disaster reflected the theological challenges of explaining such a complete defeat. Orthodox clergy struggled to understand why God had allowed Christian warriors to suffer such devastating losses to pagan enemies. Some interpreted the defeat as divine punishment for the sins of civil war and fraternal conflict that had weakened Russian unity. Trade relationships with Eastern peoples became more cautious after reports of Mongol activities reached commercial centers. Merchants who had previously travelled far into the steppe now limited their expeditions to safer, more familiar territories. This commercial caution reduced the flow of information about Mongol preparations for the much larger invasion that would come 14 years later. The administrative impact of losing so many experienced military leaders at Kalka River created problems that wouldn't become fully apparent for years. Princes who had served as military commanders, diplomatic negotiators, and territorial governors were gone. Their replacements lacked both experience and the personal relationships that had sustained Russian political systems. Cultural memory of the Kalka River defeat gradually transformed from historical fact into legendary warning. Chroniclers emphasized the disasters that resulted from princely disunity, rather than analyzing the military innovations that had made Mongol victory possible. This interpretation would prove tragically inadequate when the next Mongol invasion began in 1237. The 14 years between the Kalka River battle and Batu Khan's invasion represented the last peaceful period in medieval Russian history. Princes continued their traditional conflicts, unaware that they were squandering the final opportunity to prepare unified resistance against an enemy whose return was inevitable. The storm that would destroy their world was already gathering beyond the horizon, the fall of Kiev and the Great Destruction. Winter came early in 1237, but the cold that gripped the Russian principalities wasn't just seasonal. Reports filtered in from the east of armies, moving westward like a dark tide across the frozen steppes. This time, the Mongol invasion wasn't a reconnaissance mission or a limited raid. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, was coming to conquer and rule. The systematic nature of this new invasion became clear from its very beginning. Unlike the lightning strike that had destroyed the Russian army at Kalka River, Batu's campaign proceeded methodically from city to city, reducing each fortress before moving to the next target. Ryazan fell first in December 1237, after a siege that revealed new levels of Mongol military engineering and ruthless determination. Personal accounts from survivors describe scenes that exceeded the worst nightmares of medieval warfare. The Mongol siege engines pounded Ryazan's walls with stones and fire until the wooden fortifications collapsed into smouldering ruins. When the defenders finally surrendered, hoping for mercy that never came, every man, woman and child in the city was systematically killed. The buildings were burned so completely that chroniclers reported even the stones were charred black. Behind the scenes of Prince Yuri of Vladimir's court, the news from Ryazan created panic that court ceremonies tried desperately to conceal. The prince's advisors debated whether to seek help from southern principalities or retreat northward toward Novgorod. Some councillors argued for immediate submission, hoping to avoid Ryazan's fate. Others insisted that Vladimir's stronger walls and larger garrison could withstand any siege. The royal family's private discussions during this crisis revealed the human cost of political decisions that would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of their entire civilization. Princess wives who had grown up in palace luxury faced the prospect of death or enslavement. Children who had never known insecurity suddenly understood that their comfortable world might disappear forever. Moscow's destruction in January 1238 sent shockwaves through all the remaining Russian principalities. This was no longer a distant threat affecting only border territories. The Mongols were advancing into the heartland of Russian civilization, destroying cities that had seemed permanently secure. The 5-day siege that reduced Moscow to ashes demonstrated that even well-fortified positions couldn't withstand Batu's military machine. Palace evacuations began throughout the northern territories, as princes realized that traditional defensive strategies were failing everywhere. Royal families gathered their most precious possessions, crown jewels, religious relics, family treasures accumulated over generations, and prepared for flight to whatever refugees might still exist. These desperate measures revealed how quickly the confidence of centuries could collapse before unprecedented threats. The siege of Vladimir in February 1238 marked the climax of the Mongol advance into the Russian heartland. Prince Yuri had already fled the city, leaving his wife and children behind while he tried to organize resistance in the forest refuges, where he hoped Mongol cavalry couldn't operate effectively. The psychological impact of a ruler abandoning his capital couldn't be concealed from either the defenders or the attackers. Eyewitness accounts describe the final assault on Vladimir with details that convey both the tactical brilliance of Mongol siege warfare and the desperate courage of Russian defenders. Catapults hurled not just stones but pots of burning oil that set wooden buildings ablaze throughout the city. Mongol engineers used the frozen Klyazma River as a highway to bring siege engines directly to the walls where they would be most effective. The Cathedral of the Assumption became the final refuge for Vladimir's royal family and hundreds of noble families who hoped that sacred ground might provide protection from pagan conquerors. When Mongol warriors finally broke through the city's defences, they found the cathedral doors barricaded from within. Rather than attempt to force entry, they simply set the building on fire and waited for the smoke to do their work. Personal stories of survival and loss during these catastrophic months reveal how individual families experienced the collapse of their civilization. A few nobles escaped by disguising themselves as peasants and fleeing through forests they had previously known only as hunting grounds. Others died defending treasures that had been accumulating in their families for generations. The randomness of survival created guilt among refugees that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Prince Yuri's death at the Battle of the Sit River in March 1238 eliminated the last hope for organized resistance in the Northern Territories. The prince who had abandoned his capital trying to save his principality died in a forest battle that demonstrated the futility of traditional Russian military tactics against Mongol innovations. His headless corpse was found days later, recognizable only by the princely clothing that had once symbolized authority and protection. The destruction of Kiev in December 1240 represented the symbolic end of the golden age that had begun with Vladimir the Great's conversion. Batu Khan's forces had spent months reducing the southern principalities before turning their attention to the ancient capital. The city that had once hosted ambassadors from Constantinople and Western Europe now faced siege engines that incorporated the latest developments in Chinese military engineering. Palace life as Russian nobles had known it for 3 centuries ended during those December days in Kiev. The wooden halls where princes had held court, the stone churches where they had prayed, the treasuries where they had stored the wealth of nations, all were reduced to ash and rubble. The survivors who witnessed these scenes understood that they were watching the death of everything their ancestors had built. The human experience of conquest revealed itself in countless personal tragedies that chroniclers could only hint at in their accounts. Noble ladies who had never worked with their hands found themselves enslaved to Mongol families. Children from royal households discovered that their education in languages and court etiquette meant nothing when their owners needed shepherds or servants. Foreign ambassadors who arrived in Kiev after its destruction found a city that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The papal legate Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, travelling through Kiev 6 years later, reported seeing only 600 houses in a city that had once contained thousands. The skulls and bones of the dead still littered streets where international commerce had once flourished. The dispersal of royal families during the Mongol conquest created refugee communities that preserved fragments of the old culture in distant territories. Some nobles fled to Galicia and Volhynia in the southwest, where local princes had managed to negotiate temporary submission. Others escaped to Novgorod in the northwest, which the Mongols never conquered because its tribute submission made siege unnecessary. Religious artifacts that had defined Orthodox identity throughout the Russian territories were lost forever during these campaigns. Icons painted by master craftsmen, manuscripts copied by generations of scholarly monks, church treasures accumulated over centuries, all disappeared into the Mongol baggage trains or perished in the fires that consumed entire cities. The end of the old royal court system represented more than political change. It marked the destruction of the entire social order that had defined Russian civilization. The complex hierarchies of princes, boyars, and service nobility that had governed the territories simply ceased to exist. Traditional relationships between rulers and subjects were replaced by the stark realities of conquest and submission. Refugee camps in forests and distant cities became the only remaining centres where remnants of the old culture could survive. Here, displaced nobles shared memories of palace ceremonies, court customs, and family traditions that might otherwise have been forgotten completely. These informal gatherings preserved knowledge that would prove crucial when Russian civilization eventually began to recover. The psychological trauma of witnessing such complete destruction affected survivors for the rest of their lives. Men who had grown up expecting to inherit noble titles and territorial authority found themselves reduced to beggary or servitude. Women from aristocratic families discovered that their careful education in languages and arts meant nothing in a world where survival required very different skills. Cultural continuity depended on the scattered few who managed to preserve books, icons and other artifacts while fleeing from the general destruction, monks who carried manuscripts into hiding, nobles who buried family treasures before fleeing their estates, craftsmen who remembered techniques even when their workshops were destroyed. These individuals became the living repositories of everything that remained from the Golden Age. The Mongol conquest succeeded so completely because it destroyed not just buildings and armies, but the entire social system that had made Russian resistance possible. Traditional loyalties, customary obligations, and inherited authorities all became meaningless when the physical infrastructure that supported them was systematically eliminated. Life under the Golden Horde, the silence that settled over the Russian lands after the Mongol conquest, was unlike anything the survivors had ever experienced. Cities that had bustled with merchants and craftsmen now lay empty except for scattered refugees picking through the rubble for anything useful. The new reality was stark and terrifying. The Russian princes who had once commanded armies and collected tribute were now vassals begging for permission to rule their own ancestral territories. Alexander Nevsky faced this humiliating new world with a mixture of pragmatism and desperation that would define Russian survival for the next 2 centuries. The young prince, who had won glorious victories against Swedish and German invaders, now found himself travelling to the distant Mongol capital of Karakorum to prostrate himself before foreign rulers who held the power of life and death over his people. Palace life in the few cities that began functioning again bore little resemblance to the courts of the Golden Age. Prince Alexander's residence in Novgorod retained some ceremonial elements, but the constant awareness of Mongol oversight changed everything. Every decision, from military appointments to marriage negotiations, required consideration of how it might be perceived by the distant Khan and his representatives. The tribute system that the Mongols imposed revealed their sophisticated understanding of how to extract maximum wealth while preventing rebellion. Russian princes were required to collect specified amounts of silver, furs, and other valuable goods from their territories. These obligations were calculated precisely to absorb most available resources without quite reducing the population to starvation and complete despair. Behind the scenes of tribute collection lay countless personal tragedies as families were forced to surrender possessions that had been treasured for generations. Merchants sold their remaining stock at ruinous prices to meet tax obligations. Farmers handed over livestock that represented their only security against famine. Craftsmen watched their tools disappear into tribute payments, destroying their ability to earn future livelihoods. The hostage system that accompanied tribute collection added psychological torment to economic exploitation. Russian princes were required to send their sons to live at Mongol courts, ostensibly for education, but actually as guarantees of their father's continued loyalty. These young nobles grew up in foreign environments that shaped their worldview in ways their parents couldn't predict or control. Alexander Nevsky's own diplomatic missions to Mongol headquarters required months of dangerous travel across territories where traditional Russian authority meant nothing. The prince who had once received ambassadors in his own throne room now waited for hours in Mongol camps, hoping for audiences with officials who viewed him as just another petitioner, seeking favours from superior authority. Personal accounts from these diplomatic expeditions reveal the psychological challenges of maintaining dignity while acknowledging complete political subordination. Russian princes had to perform elaborate rituals of submission that included walking between fires to purify themselves before approaching Mongol rulers. These ceremonies were designed to reinforce the conquered people's understanding of their dependent status. Family life within Russian noble households adapted to constant uncertainty about the future. Parents could no longer promise their children inheritance of family properties or traditional positions. Marriage negotiations had to consider not just Russian political advantages, but also how potential unions might be viewed by Mongol overseers, who could veto any arrangement they deemed threatening. The administrative challenges of governing under Mongol supervision required developing entirely new governmental systems. Traditional Russian legal codes remained nominally in effect for disputes between Christians, but major crimes and political offences came under Mongol jurisdiction. This dual legal system created confusion and opportunities for manipulation that affected everyone from peasants to princes. Daily life in conquered territories reflected the economic drain of tribute payments and the social disruption of conquest. Artisans struggled to maintain their crafts when the wealthiest customers had been killed or impoverished. Farmers faced increased tax burdens while dealing with periodic raids by Mongol tribute collectors who treated any resistance as rebellion deserving severe punishment. Religious life provided some continuity with pre-conquest traditions, but even Orthodox Christianity had to adapt to new political realities. Church leaders learned to emphasize themes of patience, endurance, and acceptance of worldly suffering that helped their congregations cope with circumstances beyond their control. The theology of resistance gave way to spirituality focused on survival and preservation. Cultural fusion began almost immediately as Russian nobles observed Mongol customs and administrative practices that proved more efficient than traditional methods. Some princes adopted Mongol clothing styles and court ceremonies that impressed their subjects with demonstrations of access to powerful foreign authorities. These adaptations created hybrid cultural forms that would influence Russian development for centuries. Women in noble households faced particularly complex challenges as traditional protections disappeared and new threats emerged. Mongol customs regarding women differed significantly from Orthodox Christian practices. Russian ladies had to navigate between conflicting expectations while protecting their families from dangers they had never previously encountered. The education of young nobles during this period reflected the practical requirements of survival in a conquered territory. Traditional subjects like languages and theology continued, but now included instruction in Mongol customs, diplomatic protocols, and administrative systems. Children learned to function in both Russian and Mongol cultural contexts simultaneously. Trade relationships slowly resumed as merchants learned to operate within Mongol commercial systems that connected Europe and Asia through unprecedented networks. Russian cities that had survived the conquest found themselves linked to trade routes extending from Kiev to Beijing. This commercial integration brought new goods and ideas even as it reinforced political subordination. Military service under Mongol authority required Russian nobles to participate in campaigns that sometimes conflicted with their religious beliefs or national interests. Orthodox Christian knights found themselves fighting alongside Buddhist and pagan warriors against enemies who might include fellow Christians. These moral compromises created psychological conflicts that affected entire generations of Russian nobles. Communication systems between Russian territories and Mongol administrative centers developed into sophisticated networks that provided better information flow than had existed during the golden age of independent principalities. Mongol postal systems enabled more rapid transmission of orders, reports, and commercial correspondence across vast distances. Legal adaptations to Mongol rule created precedents that would influence Russian jurisprudence long after independence was restored. Mongol legal concepts regarding property rights, criminal punishment, and administrative authority were gradually incorporated into Russian legal traditions in ways that strengthened centralized governmental power. The psychological impact of submission affected different social classes in various ways. Nobles who had lost political authority experienced profound identity crises, while peasants found that their daily lives changed relatively little since they had always been subject to aristocratic control. Merchants discovered new opportunities even as they faced increased taxation and regulation. Personal letters from this period reveal the complex emotions of people trying to maintain family relationships and cultural identity while adapting to foreign domination. Parents worried about their children's futures in a world where traditional expectations no longer applied. Spouses separated by political obligations struggled to maintain emotional connections across vast distances. Religious art during the early period of Mongol rule began incorporating subtle influences from Asian artistic traditions while preserving orthodox theological content. Icon painters learned new techniques and color combinations that reflected exposure to Mongol decorative arts. These hybrid styles would contribute to distinctive Russian artistic traditions that emerged during the recovery period. The slow process of cultural adaptation revealed both the resilience and flexibility of Russian civilization. Communities that had seemed completely destroyed by conquest gradually developed new forms of organization that incorporated elements from both Russian and Mongol traditions. This synthesis created foundations for the eventual renaissance that would restore Russian independence and power. The gradual recovery. 2 generations after Batu Khan's conquest, Russian life began showing the first tentative signs of recovery. The shock of complete defeat was gradually giving way to adaptation and quiet resistance, as communities learned to function within Mongol political systems while preserving elements of their ancestral culture. This wasn't the dramatic revival that chroniclers would later celebrate, but rather a slow process of rebuilding that began in countless small ways throughout the conquered territories. Cities that had been reduced to ash and rubble began attracting settlers again, as trade opportunities drew merchants and craftsmen back to strategic locations along major rivers. Moscow, which had been burned completely during the initial invasion, started growing around a small wooden fortress built by Prince Daniel Alexandrovich. The new construction was modest compared to pre-conquest standards, but it represented hope that normal life might eventually return. Palace life in the recovering principalities reflected both continuity with ancient traditions and adaptation to new political realities. Prince Daniel's court in Moscow retained ceremonial elements that connected his rule to the ancient dynasty of Rurik, but the actual exercise of power required constant attention to Mongol oversight and approval. Every major decision needed to be calculated for its potential impact on tribute obligations and relationships with horde officials. The architectural evolution of Russian cities during this recovery period revealed the complex cultural influences that shaped the emerging civilization. Traditional wooden construction techniques persisted because they used locally available materials and familiar skills, but new buildings often incorporated design elements observed in Mongol structures. The resulting hybrid architecture created distinctive styles that would characterize Russian building for centuries. Family relationships within noble households adapted to political circumstances that required new forms of loyalty and cooperation. Marriage alliances were negotiated not just to strengthen ties between Russian principalities, but also to create favorable relationships with Mongol administrators and their local representatives. These strategic unions often involved complex calculations about religious differences and cultural accommodations. Trade networks that had been disrupted by conquest gradually re-established themselves as merchants learned to operate within Mongol commercial systems. Russian traders discovered that horde administrative efficiency actually facilitated long-distance commerce in ways that the fragmented principalities of the Golden Age had never achieved. Goods moved more safely and rapidly across vast territories under unified Mongol authority. Religious life provided crucial continuity during the recovery period, as Orthodox Christianity offered both spiritual comfort and cultural identity to communities struggling with foreign domination. Church construction projects, usually modest wooden structures replacing the destroyed stone cathedrals, became symbols of hope and community resilience. These building efforts required cooperation that helped rebuild social bonds devastated by conquest. The education of children during this period combined traditional Russian subjects with practical knowledge needed to function in the new political environment. Young nobles learned not just Orthodox theology and Church Slavonic literacy, but also languages and customs that would help them navigate Mongol administrative systems. This bilingual, bicultural education created generations capable of serving as intermediaries between Russian communities and foreign rulers. Daily routines in recovering cities reflected the gradual return of economic activity and social organization. Markets reopened as farmers brought produce from territories that were slowly returning to agricultural productivity. Craftsmen began practicing their trades again as demand developed for both practical goods and luxury items that demonstrated the returning prosperity of noble families. Cultural memory during the recovery period focused on preserving knowledge and traditions that had survived the conquest, rather than dwelling on losses that couldn't be recovered. Oral traditions became particularly important as manuscripts and written records had been largely destroyed. Families passed down stories, songs, and customs that maintained connections to pre-conquest civilization. Administrative innovations introduced during this period often combined Russian governmental traditions with Mongol bureaucratic methods that proved more efficient than previous systems. Prince Daniel's court developed record-keeping practices that improved tribute collection, while also providing better information about population, resources, and economic activity within his territories. Personal relationships between Russian nobles and Mongol officials evolved from purely exploitative interactions toward more complex arrangements that could benefit both parties. Some Russian princes gained influence within horde political systems by demonstrating administrative competence and cultural sensitivity. These relationships created opportunities for protecting Russian interests while fulfilling obligations to foreign rulers. Military service under Mongol authority provided Russian warriors with exposure to advanced tactics, weapons, and organizational methods that would influence their own military development. Veterans of horde campaigns returned to Russian territories with knowledge of siege engineering, cavalry operations, and strategic planning that exceeded traditional Russian military capabilities. Economic recovery proceeded unevenly across different regions and social classes. Areas with valuable natural resources or strategic trade positions recovered more quickly than territories that had been thoroughly devastated and offered little immediate profit to Mongol administrators. Noble families with flexible attitudes toward cultural adaptation often prospered, while those clinging rigidly to traditional ways struggled for survival. Diplomatic relationships between Russian principalities began showing increased cooperation as princes realized that their survival depended on coordinated responses to Mongol demands, rather than the competitive conflicts that had characterized the pre-conquest period. Shared subordination to foreign authority created common interests that transcended traditional dynastic rivalries. The role of women in noble households expanded during the recovery period, as economic necessity and social disruption created opportunities for female involvement in activities previously restricted to men. Princesses and boyar wives often managed family properties and commercial interests while their husbands travelled on diplomatic missions or military campaigns required by their Mongol overlords. Cultural synthesis during this period created new forms of artistic expression that reflected both Russian and Mongol influences. Decorative arts incorporated Asian motifs and techniques while preserving orthodox religious content and traditional Russian themes. This cultural fusion would contribute to distinctive artistic traditions that characterized Russian civilization during later periods of independence. Religious tolerance that Mongol rule imposed on conquered territories actually benefited Orthodox Christianity in some unexpected ways. Church leaders gained experience in defending their faith through intellectual persuasion rather than political authority. This theological sophistication would prove valuable when Russian Christianity eventually faced challenges from both Catholic and Protestant influences. The psychological transformation of Russian society during the recovery period involved developing new concepts of political authority and social organization that incorporated lessons learned through conquest and submission. Traditional ideas about princely power and noble privilege were modified by practical experience of foreign domination and administrative efficiency. Population movements during the recovery period gradually shifted demographic balances in ways that would influence Russian political development for centuries. Northern territories like Moscow and Vladimir attracted settlers fleeing from areas under more direct Mongol control, creating population concentrations that would eventually challenge horde authority when circumstances permitted. This slow process of recovery laid foundations for the eventual revival of Russian independence and power. The skills, relationships, and institutional innovations that developed during the period of Mongol domination would prove crucial when later generations of Russian leaders began asserting greater autonomy. The storm that had seemed to destroy Russian civilization ultimately created conditions for an even more impressive renaissance. Ivan Kalita and the Moscow dynasty. In the early decades of the 14th century, Moscow was still just another minor principality among many scattered across the Russian territories. The wooden fortress that protected this trading settlement was smaller than Kiev's ruins, less impressive than Novgorod's walls, and commanded fewer resources than Vladimir's recovering economy. Yet within this modest Kremlin lived a prince whose political genius would transform his insignificant domain into the foundation of a new Russian empire. Ivan Danilovich inherited Moscow from his father in 1325 with ambitions that seemed wildly disproportionate to his actual resources. The young prince possessed little territory, commanded a small army, and controlled limited wealth compared to his more established rivals. But he understood something that his fellow rulers had missed. Under Mongol domination, the greatest power belonged not to those with the strongest fortresses, but to those who could most effectively manage the tribute system. The nickname Kalita, meaning money bag, that Ivan acquired during his reign revealed both his greater strength and the source of his growing influence. While other princes struggled to meet their tribute obligations to the Golden Horde, Ivan consistently delivered his payments early and often exceeded the required amounts. This financial reliability earned him the trust of Mongol administrators, who appreciated dealing with subordinates they could depend on. Behind the scenes of Ivan's tribute collection, operations lay a sophisticated network of relationships that extended throughout the Russian territories and deep into Mongol administrative systems. The prince cultivated friendships with horde officials through generous gifts and personal attention that went far beyond formal diplomatic requirements. These relationships provided him with advance information about Mongol policies and opportunities that his rivals never discovered. Palace life in early 14th century Moscow reflected Ivan's careful balance between demonstrating prosperity that impressed visitors and maintaining the modest appearance that reassured Mongol overseers he posed no threat to their authority. The prince's wooden halls were decorated with luxury goods that showed his success, but the scale remained deliberately smaller than the grand ceremonies that had characterized pre-conquest courts. Family strategies within Ivan's household revealed the long-term planning that would eventually elevate Moscow above all rival principalities. The prince's marriage alliances were negotiated not just for immediate political advantages, but to create networks of relationships that would benefit his descendants for generations. His children were educated to understand both Russian traditions and Mongol administrative systems, preparing them to function effectively in the complex political environment they would inherit. Ivan's personal wealth accumulated through methods that combined legitimate business activities with political opportunities available only to those in his privileged position. His extensive loans to other princes created dependencies that could be converted into political influence when circumstances required. The interest payments from these financial relationships provided additional resources for tribute payments and gift-giving that strengthened his position with Mongol authorities. The prince's reputation for reliability extended beyond mere financial transactions to encompass his role as a political problem-solver for Mongol administrators who preferred to avoid direct involvement in Russian territorial disputes. When conflicts arose between subordinate princes, horde officials increasingly turned to Ivan as a mediator whose settlements would be accepted by all parties and enforced without requiring expensive military interventions. Daily routines in Ivan's court balanced the practical demands of governing a growing territory with the ceremonial requirements that maintained his status among fellow Russian princes. Morning audiences often included representatives from other principalities seeking loans, military assistance, or diplomatic support. Afternoon sessions were devoted to managing the commercial activities that generated the wealth supporting his political ambitions. The administrative innovations that Ivan introduced in Moscow created governmental systems that could efficiently manage territories far larger than his original inheritance. His chancellery developed record-keeping practices that tracked tribute obligations, loan agreements, and commercial contracts with unprecedented precision. These bureaucratic improvements would prove essential when Moscow began absorbing neighboring principalities. Personal relationships between Ivan and his fellow princes reflected the complex dynamics of competition and cooperation that characterized Russian politics under Mongol rule. The prince maintained diplomatic courtesy with rivals, while quietly undermining their positions through superior financial resources and better relationships with horde authorities. These strategies required psychological sophistication that Ivan demonstrated consistently throughout his reign. The acquisition of the title Grand Prince of Vladimir and Moscow in 1331 marked Ivan's emergence as the dominant figure among the Russian princes. This promotion, granted by the Golden Horde in recognition of his administrative competence and political reliability, provided him with formal authority over territories that had previously been governed independently. The ceremony that marked this elevation took place in the Mongol capital, emphasizing that Russian political advancement still required foreign approval. Marriage negotiations during Ivan's reign reveal the expanding scope of his political influence and growing confidence in Moscow's future prospects. His children's betrothals were arranged with families from increasingly distant and prestigious principalities, creating alliance networks that extended far beyond Moscow's immediate neighbors. These matrimonial diplomacy efforts required careful attention to both Russian noble traditions and Mongol administrative concerns. Religious policies under Ivan's governance demonstrated his understanding that Orthodox Christianity could serve as both spiritual comfort for his subjects and political tool for unifying diverse territories under Moscow's authority. The prince's generous donations to monasteries and church construction projects earned him ecclesiastical support while demonstrating the prosperity that attracted settlers and investors to his territories. The economic transformation of Moscow during Ivan's reign reflected his success in converting political relationships into commercial advantages. Tribute collection responsibilities provided opportunities for profitable money-changing operations. Loan agreements with other princes created steady income streams. Trade relationships developed through his extensive travel generated wealth that supported further territorial expansion. Family life within Ivan's household adapted to the increasing demands of governing territories that grew steadily throughout his reign. The prince's children received education that prepared them not just for traditional noble pursuits, but for the complex administrative and diplomatic challenges that would define their futures as rulers of an expanding state. Cultural developments in early 14th century Moscow began showing influences that would eventually distinguish the city from other Russian principalities. Art and architecture incorporated elements borrowed from both traditional Russian sources and Mongol artistic traditions that Ivan had observed during his frequent travels to Horde administrative centers. These cultural syntheses created distinctive styles that would influence Russian artistic development for centuries. Military capabilities remained limited during Ivan's reign, but the prince used his financial resources to maintain forces adequate for defending his territories while avoiding provocative displays that might alarm Mongol authorities. His military strategy focused on internal security and defense, rather than aggressive expansion that would require direct confrontation with foreign powers. The legacy of Ivan Kalita's reign extended far beyond the territorial expansions and wealth accumulation that impressed his contemporaries. His governmental innovations, diplomatic methods, and administrative systems created foundations that would support Moscow's evolution from minor principality to imperial capital. The political relationships he cultivated and the institutional frameworks he established would prove crucial when his descendants began asserting greater independence from Mongol authority. The transformation of Moscow from insignificant trading post to regional power center during Ivan's 30-year reign demonstrated the possibilities for advancement that existed within the Mongol political system for those who understood how to exploit its opportunities. The prince who began his career as a minor vassal died as the most powerful Russian ruler of his generation, having established the dynasty that would eventually unite all Russian territories under Muscovite authority. Dmitry Donskoy in the fight for freedom. Prince Dmitry Ivanovich came of age during a time when the very air in Moscow seemed to whisper of change. Born in 1350, he grew up in Ivan Kalita's palace, watching his grandfather accumulate wealth and influence through careful submission to Mongol authority. But by the time young Dmitry inherited the throne in 1359, the Golden Horde was showing signs of internal weakness that would create opportunities his ancestors had never dared to imagine. The 9-year-old prince who became ruler of Moscow faced challenges that would have overwhelmed most adult leaders. Rival principalities immediately challenged his inheritance, believing they could exploit the succession of a child to advance their own territorial ambitions. The Golden Horde itself was fragmenting into competing factions whose civil wars created uncertainty about which Mongol authorities Russian princes should recognize as legitimate. Behind palace walls, the Regency Council that governed during Dmitry's minority struggled with decisions that could determine whether Moscow's carefully built influence would survive the transition to new leadership. Metropolitan Alexis, the Orthodox Church leader who served as the young prince's primary advisor, understood that preserving Moscow's position would require navigating between traditional submission to Mongol authority and the growing expectations of Russian nobles who hoped for greater independence. Family life during Dmitri's early years reflected the tensions between his grandmother's memories of pre-conquest freedom and the practical realities of continued Mongol oversight. Stories told around the family hearth included both heroic tales of ancient Russian victories and cautionary accounts of what happened to princes who challenged foreign authority too directly. The young ruler absorbed both traditions, creating internal conflicts that would shape his entire reign. The personal transformation that turned Dmitri from a careful child ruler into the warrior who would eventually challenge Mongol supremacy began during his teenage years as he witnessed the increasing chaos within the Golden Horde. Competing Khans demanded tribute from the same territories while threatening violence against princes who chose the wrong faction. These impossible situations convinced Dmitri that submission was becoming as dangerous as rebellion. Palace ceremonies during Dmitri's coming of age reflected Moscow's growing confidence and international recognition. Foreign ambassadors from Lithuania, Poland, and even Western European courts began treating the young prince as a significant political figure rather than merely another Mongol vassal. These diplomatic encounters exposed Dmitri to alternative models of governance that didn't require subordination to steppe empires. The decisive moment in Dmitri's personal evolution came in 1378, when he achieved his first major military victory over Mongol forces at the Battle of the Volga River. This engagement wasn't a planned challenge to Horde authority, but rather a defensive action against raiders who had been sent to collect unauthorized tribute. The victory demonstrated that Mongol military superiority was no longer absolute, giving hope to Russian communities that had lived under foreign domination for nearly 150 years. Personal accounts of the Volga River battle reveal the psychological impact of this unprecedented success on both Dmitri and his warriors. Russian soldiers who had grown up believing Mongol forces were invincible suddenly discovered they could defeat their former masters in direct combat. The prince himself experienced the intoxicating realization that the political calculations that had guided his family for generations might no longer be necessary. The 2 years of preparation that followed the Volga River victory transformed Moscow from a cautious principality into the center of a national resistance movement. Dmitri's agents traveled throughout the Russian territories, building alliances with princes who had previously competed for Mongol favor. The traditional rivalries that had weakened Russian resistance since the original conquest gave way to unprecedented cooperation based on shared hopes for independence. Behind the scenes of military preparation for what would become the Battle of Kulikovo, palace life in Moscow adapted to the demands of organizing the largest Russian army assembled since the catastrophic defeat at Kalka River 150 years earlier. The prince's household became a military headquarters where strategic planning competed with diplomatic negotiations and logistical coordination for the ruler's attention. Family relationships within Dmitri's court reflected the enormous personal stakes involved in challenging Mongol authority. The prince's wife Eudoxia understood that her husband's military gamble could result in their children's deaths and the complete destruction of everything their family had built over 3 generations. These private conversations between spouses reveal the human emotions behind political decisions that would affect millions of people. The spiritual preparation that preceded the Kulikovo campaign demonstrated the crucial role that Orthodox Christianity played in transforming what might have been simply another princely rebellion into a holy war for Russian independence. Dmitri's consultations with Saint Sergius of Radonej provided both personal courage and religious legitimacy for actions that violated the political order that had governed Russian territories since Batu Khan's conquest. Personal fears that gripped Dmitri as the campaign began were shared by thousands of warriors who understood they were marching toward a battle that would determine not just their own survival, but the future of Russian civilization. The prince's private prayers, recorded by monastic chroniclers, reveal a leader seeking divine guidance while struggling with doubts about the wisdom of his unprecedented challenge to foreign authority. The Battle of Kulikovo on September 8, 1380, began in morning mist that seemed to symbolize the uncertainty surrounding this historic confrontation. Dmitri made the extraordinary decision to fight as an ordinary warrior rather than commanding from a safe position behind his army. This personal courage inspired his troops while demonstrating that Moscow's prince was willing to risk everything for the independence his people desperately wanted. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological moment when Russian forces realized they were winning the greatest battle fought on their territories since the Mongol conquest. The sight of Mongol cavalry retreating in disorder after more than a century of unbroken dominance created euphoria that spread throughout the Russian army. Warriors who had begun the day expecting probable death suddenly understood they were witnessing the birth of a new era. The personal cost of victory became apparent when Dmitri was found unconscious beneath piles of bodies after the battle ended. The prince who had led from the front had nearly paid the ultimate price for his courage. His survival seemed miraculous to followers who interpreted his recovery as divine approval for the Russian cause. The wounds he suffered would affect his health for the rest of his life, but they also enhanced his prestige as a warrior leader. Palace celebrations following the Kulikovo victory revealed the psychological transformation that affected Russian society when news of the impossible victory spread throughout the territories. Moscow's court became the center of jubilation that combined religious thanksgiving with political triumph. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed these celebrations understood they were observing the emergence of a new power that could no longer be dismissed as merely another Mongol dependency. The aftermath of Kulikovo also revealed the limits of what military victory could achieve without corresponding political and economic changes. The Golden Horde remained a formidable force capable of organizing devastating retaliation against Russian territories. Dmitri's victory had proven that Mongol domination could be challenged, but it hadn't yet created the conditions for permanent independence. Family life in the years following Kulikovo balanced celebration of unprecedented achievement with preparation for the Mongol retaliation that everyone knew would eventually come. Dmitri's children grew up understanding that their father had accomplished something extraordinary, but they also learned that preserving those achievements would require continued struggle and sacrifice from their generation. The raid that Khan Tokhtamysh launched against Moscow in 1382 demonstrated the continuing dangers of challenging Mongol authority. The prince who had won glory at Kulikovo was forced to flee his capital as foreign armies once again burned Russian cities and collected tribute from territories that had briefly tasted freedom. These humiliating experiences revealed the gap between military victory and actual independence. Personal correspondence from the 1380s shows Dmitri struggling with the psychological challenges of leadership during this period of uncertainty. The prince who had inspired a generation of Russians to believe in the possibility of freedom now faced the responsibility of preserving their hope while acknowledging the practical limitations that continued to constrain their ambitions. The educational system that Dmitri established for his sons reflected his determination to prepare the next generation for the continuing struggle that would be required to achieve lasting independence. These young princes learned traditional skills of warfare and diplomacy, but their education also emphasized the importance of patient, long-term strategies that could succeed where dramatic military gestures might fail. Daily routines in Dmitri's court during his later years combined the ceremonial requirements of traditional Russian princely authority with the practical demands of governing territories that remained technically subordinate to foreign power. The prince aged prematurely due to his Kulikovo wounds, but he continued planning for the eventual independence that he had proven was possible, even if he couldn't quite achieve it permanently. The death of Dmitri Donskoy in 1389 marked the end of the first serious Russian challenge to Mongol domination, but his legacy would inspire the continuing efforts that eventually achieved the independence he had fought to establish. The final struggle for independence, the prince who had dared to defeat the seemingly invincible Golden Horde, left behind more than territorial gains. He had restored Russian confidence and demonstrated that foreign domination was not permanent or inevitable. Ivan III came to the throne of Moscow in 1462, inheriting both the ambitions and the caution that had characterized his family for generations. His grandfather Dmitry Donskoy had proven that Mongol forces could be defeated, but the brutal retaliation that followed Kulikovo had also demonstrated the dangers of premature challenges to foreign authority. The young prince, who would eventually be called Ivan the Great, spent his early reign carefully building the strength that would be required for the final confrontation with the Golden Horde. The personal transformation that changed Ivan from a careful vassal prince into the sovereign ruler of an independent Russian state took place gradually over his 43-year reign. Unlike his grandfather's dramatic challenge at Kulikovo, Ivan's approach to independence relied on patient diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the gradual accumulation of territory that would make Moscow too powerful for the fragmenting horde to control effectively. Palace life during Ivan's early years reflected the continuing reality of Mongol oversight, but with subtle changes that revealed growing Russian confidence. Court ceremonies retained traditional elements that acknowledged submission to foreign authority, but new architectural projects and artistic commissions suggested ambitions that extended beyond mere survival under foreign domination. The young prince was learning to project strength while avoiding provocative gestures that might prompt preemptive attacks. Behind the scenes of diplomatic negotiations that occupied much of Ivan's attention, the prince was quietly building alliance networks that would prove crucial when direct confrontation with the horde finally became unavoidable. Marriage agreements with Lithuanian nobles, commercial treaties with Venetian merchants, and military cooperation agreements with Crimean Tatars created a web of relationships that would isolate the Golden Horde when the final crisis arrived. The annexation of Novgorod in the 1470s demonstrated both Ivan's diplomatic skills and his willingness to use military force when necessary to achieve his strategic objectives. This ancient city had maintained its independence throughout the Mongol period through careful neutrality and tribute payments, but its continued autonomy threatened Ivan's vision of a unified Russian state, capable of challenging foreign domination. Family discussions within Ivan's household during the Novgorod crisis reveal the complex calculations that influenced his decision-making process. The prince's advisors worried that aggressive action against fellow Russians might provoke Mongol intervention, while his military commanders argued that Novgorod's wealth and strategic position were essential for any serious challenge to foreign authority. Ivan's final decision reflected his growing confidence that the horde was too weak to effectively respond to Russian territorial consolidation. The marriage of Ivan III to Sophia Paleolog in 1472 marked a crucial turning point in Moscow's international status and the prince's personal evolution toward independent sovereignty. This Byzantine princess, niece of the last emperor of Constantinople, brought not just diplomatic prestige but also theories of governance that justified absolute authority without reference to foreign approval. The wedding celebrations demonstrated Moscow's emergence as a significant European power. Personal letters between Ivan and his wife reveal the influence that Sophia exercised over her husband's political development during the crucial years when he was deciding whether to risk open confrontation with the Golden Horde. The princess, who had grown up in the sophisticated courts of Italy and Byzantium, helped Ivan understand that effective sovereignty required not just military strength, but also the ceremonial and diplomatic apparatus that would convince foreign powers to recognize Russian independence. The psychological preparation that preceded Ivan's final challenge to Mongol authority involved years of careful planning and spiritual preparation that drew on both practical political calculations and religious conviction. Orthodox Church leaders provided theological justification for breaking oaths of submission that had been extracted through conquest, while military advisors developed strategic plans for defensive campaigns that would avoid the mistakes that had led to earlier disasters. Palace renovations during the 1470s reflected Ivan's growing determination to create a court that would be worthy of an independent sovereign rather than a Mongol vassal. Italian architects brought expertise in fortress design and ceremonial architecture that transformed the Moscow Kremlin into a complex capable of impressing foreign ambassadors while providing security adequate for defending the emerging Russian state. The diplomatic maneuvering that preceded the final confrontation with the Golden Horde revealed Ivan's sophisticated understanding of the international political situation that made Russian independence possible. The prince's agents worked to secure neutrality agreements with Lithuania, military support from Crimean Tatars, and commercial backing from Italian city-states that provided the international context necessary for challenging Mongol authority. Family support during the crisis of 1480 proved crucial for maintaining Ivan's resolve when the actual confrontation with Khan Ahmad began. The prince's sons, trained since childhood for the roles they would play in an independent Russian state, provided both military leadership and emotional encouragement during months of uncertainty about whether diplomatic pressure could achieve what military force had failed to accomplish: the stand on the Ugra River in October and November 1480 became the anticlimactic finale to centuries of Russian subordination to steppe empires. Two armies faced each other across the water for weeks, while their commanders engaged in psychological warfare that tested nerves rather than military capabilities. Ivan's decision to maintain defensive positions while refusing to acknowledge Mongol authority created a deadlock that ultimately favoured the Russians. Personal accounts from participants in the Ugra confrontation describe the strange atmosphere of a military campaign where the crucial battles were fought in the minds of leaders rather than on physical battlefields. Russian soldiers watched their prince refuse demands for submission that would have been automatically accepted by his predecessors. Mongol warriors observed their Khan's inability to enforce obedience that had been taken for granted for 2.5 centuries. The moment when Khan Ahmad finally withdrew from the Ugra River marked the end of the Mongol yoke that had dominated Russian politics since Batu Khan's conquest. Contemporary chronicles struggle to convey the emotional impact of this bloodless victory on people who had grown up believing that foreign domination was a permanent feature of their political landscape. The psychological liberation proved as important as the diplomatic achievement. Behind palace walls, the celebrations that followed news of Ahmad's retreat combined religious thanksgiving with political triumph in ways that revealed how completely the successful defiance of Mongol authority had transformed Russian consciousness. Ivan's court became the centre of jubilation that spread throughout territories that were suddenly, almost impossibly, free to govern themselves according to their own traditions and interests. The administrative challenges that followed independence required developing governmental systems adequate for managing territories that no longer needed to accommodate foreign oversight. Ivan's chancellery expanded rapidly as bureaucratic functions previously handled by Mongol administrators were transferred to Russian officials who needed to learn new procedures while maintaining political stability during the transition. Daily life within the royal household adapted to the reality that the prince was now truly sovereign rather than merely the most privileged among vassals. Court ceremonies were revised to eliminate references to foreign authority while emphasizing Ivan's legitimacy as heir to the pre-conquest Russian princes. Foreign ambassadors found themselves dealing with a ruler who claimed equality with Western European monarchs, rather than subordinate status as a provincial governor. The psychological impact on Ivan himself was perhaps most dramatic of all. The prince who had spent 18 years carefully managing tribute obligations and diplomatic submissions to foreign authority suddenly found himself free to pursue policies based solely on Russian interests. Personal letters from this period suggest both exhilaration and anxiety, as Ivan adjusted to responsibilities he had spent decades preparing for, but had never actually exercised. Religious ceremonies marking the end of the Mongol yoke emphasized themes of divine liberation and national restoration that would influence Russian political theology for centuries. Orthodox Church leaders proclaimed that God had finally freed his chosen people from pagan bondage, creating religious interpretations of independence that enhanced Ivan's authority while providing spiritual framework for understanding Russia's new international status. The death of Khan Ahmad shortly after his retreat from the Ugra River seemed to provide divine confirmation that the age of foreign domination had ended permanently. Ivan's court celebrated news of his former overlord's death as evidence that Providence approved of Russian independence and would protect the emerging state from attempts to restore foreign authority. Military reforms introduced after independence reflected Ivan's determination to ensure that Russian territories would never again be vulnerable to the kind of conquest that had devastated his ancestors' kingdom. New fortress construction, improved weapons production, and expanded recruitment created military capabilities that would deter potential aggressors while supporting diplomatic initiatives aimed at expanding Russian influence. Ivan the Great and the new Russian state. The marriage of Ivan III to Sophia Paleolog had brought more than diplomatic prestige to the Moscow court. It had introduced concepts of imperial governance that would transform not just the prince's personal authority, but the entire nature of Russian political life. The Byzantine princess who arrived in Moscow in 1472 carried with her the memory of an empire that had lasted for over 1,000 years, and she was determined to help her husband create a worthy successor to the fallen Constantinople. Palace life in the 1480s and 1490s reflected this imperial transformation as Italian architects rebuilt the Moscow Kremlin according to specifications that would impress foreign ambassadors with visual evidence of Russia's emergence as a great power. The wooden fortress that had served Ivan's ancestors was gradually replaced by brick walls and stone cathedrals that could accommodate the ceremonial requirements of a sovereign state while providing security appropriate for an independent monarch. Sophia's influence on court culture extended far beyond architectural projects to encompass the daily routines and ceremonial protocols that defined life within the royal household. The princess who had observed imperial ceremonies in Constantinople and Renaissance court culture in Italy introduced standards of luxury and sophistication that elevated Moscow's international status while satisfying her husband's growing ambitions for recognition as a legitimate European monarch. Family dynamics within Ivan's household revealed the complex personal relationships that supported his political achievements, while creating tensions that would affect future generations. The prince's children by his first wife competed for inheritance rights and political influence with the sons Sophia bore him, creating succession rivalries that reflected both traditional Russian customs and the new imperial ambitions that the Byzantine princess had introduced. The education that Ivan's sons received combined traditional Russian subjects with new curricula designed to prepare them for governing an empire rather than merely managing a principality. Greek language instruction provided access to Byzantine political and theological texts, while Italian tutors taught Renaissance art and diplomatic protocols. These educational innovations created generations of Russian nobles capable of functioning effectively in sophisticated international environments. Daily routines in the royal palace during the 1490s balanced the practical demands of governing expanding territories with the ceremonial requirements that demonstrated Ivan's imperial status. Morning audiences for foreign ambassadors were conducted according to protocols adapted from Byzantine and Italian court practices, while afternoon sessions devoted to domestic administration relied on governmental systems that had evolved from traditional Russian and Mongol administrative methods. The construction projects that transformed Moscow during Ivan's later reign reflected both his personal vision of appropriate imperial architecture and Sophia's determination to create a capital worthy of comparison with the great cities of Europe. The Cathedral of the Assumption, completed in 1479, provided a ceremonial setting for coronations and state occasions that rivaled the most impressive churches in Constantinople or Rome. Marriage negotiations for Ivan's children revealed the expanding scope of Russian diplomatic ambitions as the emerging empire sought alliance relationships with established European powers. These matrimonial discussions required unprecedented attention to religious differences, ceremonial protocols, and political implications that reflected Russia's new status as an independent kingdom rather than a Mongol dependency. Court entertainment during this period evolved from traditional Russian forms to incorporate influences from both Byzantine and Italian cultural traditions that Sophia had introduced. Musical performances featured both orthodox liturgical compositions and secular works adapted from Western European sources. Dance and theatrical presentations combined Russian folk elements with sophisticated choreographic concepts observed in Renaissance courts. The administrative innovations that Ivan introduced during his later reign created governmental systems capable of managing territories that extended from the Arctic Ocean to the Caspian Sea. These bureaucratic developments combined traditional Russian institutional forms with administrative techniques borrowed from Byzantine and Italian governmental systems that Sophia had recommended based on her extensive international experience. Personal relationships between Ivan and his nobles adapted to the new realities of imperial governance that required different forms of loyalty and service than had been necessary during the period of Mongol subordination. Traditional boyar families found themselves competing for influence with newer service nobles whose positions depended entirely on the prince's favour rather than ancestral privileges. Religious policies under Ivan's governance reflected both his orthodox convictions and his determination to establish Russia as the legitimate successor to the Byzantine Empire in protecting and promoting Eastern Christianity. The concept of Moscow as the Third Rome, the final earthly repository of true Christian authority after the fall of Rome and Constantinople, provided theological justification for imperial ambitions while appealing to Russian national pride. The legal codes that Ivan promulgated during this period combined traditional Russian customary law with Byzantine legal principles and practical administrative requirements that reflected the complexity of governing diverse populations across vast territories. These legal innovations created precedents that would influence Russian jurisprudence for centuries, while establishing the prince's authority as the supreme source of legal legitimacy. Cultural developments during Ivan's later reign showed the influence of international contacts that had expanded dramatically since Russian independence. Art and architecture incorporated elements from Italian Renaissance traditions, while preserving distinctively Russian characteristics. Literary works began exploring themes of imperial destiny and national greatness that reflected the transformed political circumstances. Military organization under Ivan's governance evolved from traditional Russian defensive systems to incorporate offensive capabilities adequate for protecting expanding borders, while supporting diplomatic initiatives in regions that had previously been beyond Russian influence. These military improvements provided practical security while demonstrating the strength that reinforced diplomatic negotiations. Trade relationships flourished as Russian independence opened commercial opportunities that had been restricted during the period of Mongol domination. Moscow became a major center for international commerce connecting European and Asian markets through trade routes that generated wealth supporting imperial ambitions while providing employment for growing urban populations. The establishment of formal diplomatic relationships with European powers marked Russia's emergence from centuries of isolation and subordination to achieve recognition as a legitimate member of the international community. Ambassador exchanges with Venice, the Holy Roman Empire, and other major powers created precedents for ongoing diplomatic relationships that would support Russian international objectives. Palace ceremonies during Ivan's final years reflected the complete transformation from princely authority to imperial sovereignty that had occurred during his reign. Coronation rituals, diplomatic receptions, and religious observances followed protocols that emphasized Russia's equality with established European monarchies, while preserving traditional elements that connected the new empire to its ancient roots. Family preparations for succession revealed the success of Ivan's efforts to establish governmental institutions capable of surviving dynastic transitions. His son Vasily had been trained from childhood to assume imperial responsibilities, while administrative systems had been developed to provide continuity during periods of political uncertainty. The death of Ivan III in 1505 marked the end of the medieval period in Russian history and the beginning of the imperial era that would eventually make Russia one of the world's great powers. The prince who had inherited a modest principality subordinate to foreign authority died as the sovereign of an empire that stretched across 2 continents and commanded respect from the most powerful European courts. The legacy of Ivan the Great extended far beyond territorial conquests or administrative innovations to encompass the psychological and cultural transformation that had restored Russian confidence after centuries of foreign domination. The institutional foundations he had established would support centuries of imperial expansion, while the cultural and diplomatic precedents he'd created would influence Russian development through multiple dynasties and political systems. Moscow's evolution from minor trading post to imperial capital during Ivan's reign demonstrated the possibilities that existed for ambitious leaders who understood how to exploit changing international circumstances while building domestic institutions capable of supporting expanded political ambitions. The medieval Russia that had begun with tribal settlements along forest rivers had achieved its destiny as a great empire capable of shaping European and Asian political development for centuries to come. Behind palace walls, royal family life, from the earliest wooden halls of Novgorod to Ivan the Great's stone palaces in Moscow, the rhythm of royal family life provided continuity through centuries of political upheaval and cultural transformation. Behind the grand ceremonies and diplomatic negotiations that filled the chronicles lay the intimate human stories of parents raising children, spouses sharing private moments, and families adapting to circumstances that range from golden prosperity to devastating conquest. Children born into Russian royal families learned from their earliest years that their lives belonged not just to themselves, but to the continuation of dynasties that stretched back through generations of rulers. A prince's son in Vladimir the Great's court received education that began before dawn with religious instruction, continued through morning lessons in languages and mathematics, and concluded with afternoon training in horsemanship and weapons. These young nobles understood that every skill they mastered might someday determine their people's survival. The personal letters that survive from various periods reveal how royal parents struggled with the same concerns that troubled ordinary families. Despite their extraordinary circumstances, Princess Olga's correspondence with tutors about her son Sviatoslav's education shows a mother worried that military training was consuming too much of a young boy's time. Centuries later, Ivan III's notes about his son Vasily reveal similar parental anxieties about preparing a child for responsibilities that would affect millions of people. Education within royal households evolved dramatically across the medieval centuries, but the fundamental challenge remained constant: how to prepare children for leadership roles while allowing them some semblance of normal childhood development. Early Slavic princes learned primarily through observation and participation in adult activities. Children sat quietly during tribal councils, watched their fathers negotiate with merchants, and absorbed knowledge through stories told around evening fires. The Byzantine influence that entered Russian culture after Vladimir's conversion transformed educational practices in ways that created more formal learning environments within palace settings. Royal children began studying Greek texts, theological writings, and diplomatic correspondence that connected them to international intellectual traditions. Princess Anna Yaroslavna's literacy impressed French nobles precisely because her Russian education had been more sophisticated than what most Western European royal children received. Marriage arrangements for royal children revealed the intersection between personal affection and political necessity that defined aristocratic family life throughout the medieval period. Some chronicles hint at genuine love matches. Vladimir's marriage to Olga, for instance, seems to have involved real emotional attachment despite its political advantages, but most royal marriages served dynastic purposes that required young people to sacrifice personal preferences for family obligations. Women in Russian royal households navigated complex expectations that varied significantly, depending on historical period and individual circumstances. Early Slavic customs had granted women considerable authority in household management and property ownership. Byzantine Christian influences introduced different concepts of feminine roles that emphasized piety and domestic virtue. The Mongol period created new challenges as noble ladies learned to function within foreign cultural systems while preserving their own traditions. Princess Olga's transformation from grieving widow to powerful regent demonstrated the possibilities that existed for women capable of exercising political authority during periods of crisis. Her personal correspondence reveals a ruler who combined maternal protective instincts with strategic thinking that rivaled any male contemporary. Later royal women found their opportunities more constrained, but they continued exercising informal influence through household management, religious patronage, and diplomatic relationships. Palace entertainment throughout the centuries reflected both the cultural influences that shaped each historical period and the continuing human need for joy and celebration despite political uncertainties. The pagan festivals of early Russian courts featured athletic competitions, musical performances, and storytelling that preserved tribal memories while strengthening social bonds among warrior aristocracies. Christian conversion transformed palace entertainment by introducing new types of celebrations that combined religious observance with royal display. Easter and Christmas festivities became elaborate affairs that lasted for days and provided opportunities for princes to demonstrate generosity while reinforcing social hierarchies through gift-giving and ceremonial honours. These celebrations required months of preparation and created employment for countless craftsmen, musicians, and cooks. Music within royal households evolved from simple folk melodies, accompanying tribal gatherings, to sophisticated performances that incorporated influences from Byzantium, Western Europe, and eventually the Mongol territories. Court musicians learned to perform both sacred liturgical compositions and secular songs that entertained guests while preserving historical memories and cultural traditions. Storytelling remained central to palace entertainment throughout all periods, serving educational and inspirational functions as well as providing simple enjoyment. Professional storytellers preserved epic tales about ancient heroes, while chroniclers documented contemporary events for future generations. Royal children learned their family histories through stories that combined factual information with legendary elements that enhanced dynastic prestige. Religious observances shaped daily routines within royal households in ways that became more elaborate and time-consuming after Christian conversion. Morning prayers, evening vespers, and seasonal festivals created regular rhythms that structured time while providing spiritual framework for understanding both personal and political challenges. The private chapels that became standard features in royal residences after Vladimir's conversion served as intimate spaces where families could worship together away from the public ceremonies that defined their official religious duties. These personal devotions often provided the only truly private moments available to rulers whose lives were otherwise completely public. Fasting periods required by Orthodox Christianity affected not just spiritual practices, but also practical aspects of household management, as kitchen staffs learned to prepare meals that met religious requirements while satisfying the nutritional needs of active political and military leaders. These dietary restrictions created opportunities for cultural exchange as cooks learned techniques from Greek, Bulgarian, and other Orthodox traditions. Family relationships within royal households reflected both the affectionate bonds that united parents and children and the political pressures that could tear families apart when succession disputes arose. The civil wars that followed Yaroslav the Wise's death demonstrated how quickly family loyalty could collapse under pressure of competing ambitions and territorial claims. Personal memoirs and intimate letters reveal that royal families experienced the same emotional joys and tragedies that affected ordinary people, but with consequences that extended far beyond immediate family circles. A prince's depression could affect governmental decisions that impacted thousands of subjects. A royal marriage's happiness or failure influenced diplomatic relationships that shaped international politics. The physical spaces where royal families lived evolved from simple wooden halls to elaborate stone complexes, but the basic functions remained constant, providing security for the ruling dynasty while accommodating the ceremonial and administrative activities that defined sovereign authority. Private family quarters were typically separated from public areas, creating domestic environments where normal human relationships could develop, despite the extraordinary pressures of political leadership. Seasonal rhythms affected royal households just as they influenced peasant communities, though aristocratic families had resources that protected them from the survival challenges that dominated ordinary people's lives. Winter months were devoted to indoor activities like education, craft production, and religious observances. Summer brought military campaigns, diplomatic missions, and the extensive travel required for governing scattered territories. The continuity of family traditions across generations provided stability that helped Russian royal dynasties survive periods of external conquest and internal political upheaval. Customs regarding child-rearing, marriage ceremonies, and religious observances created cultural frameworks that preserved essential elements of Russian identity even when political independence was lost. Customs, traditions, and celebrations. The Great Wheel of Seasons turned steadily above the Russian territories, marking time with celebrations that connected royal courts to both ancient traditions and evolving religious practices. From the earliest spring festivals that honoured returning life to the solemn winter observances that prepared communities for survival during the harshest months, these seasonal rhythms provided structure and meaning that transcended individual reigns and political upheavals. Spring celebrations in royal courts evolved from simple pagan fertility rituals to elaborate Orthodox Easter ceremonies that combined religious significance with displays of dynastic prosperity. The pre-Christian festivals that welcomed returning warmth and celebrated agricultural renewal gradually transformed into Holy Week observances that required weeks of preparation and involved entire palace communities in religious and social activities. Easter became the most important celebration in Christian Russian courts, requiring elaborate preparations that demonstrated both royal piety and administrative efficiency. Palace kitchens worked for days preparing traditional foods that would be blessed during religious ceremonies and shared during family gatherings that reinforced social bonds, while providing opportunities for political reconciliation after the conflicts that inevitably arose during long winter months. Summer festivals retained more obvious connections to ancient pagan traditions even after Christian conversion, as agricultural ceremonies that blessed crops and celebrated abundance proved adaptable to Orthodox Christian theological frameworks. Royal participation in these seasonal observances connected ruling families to the agricultural communities that supported their power, while providing occasions for demonstrating generous leadership through public feasting and gift-giving. The harvest celebrations that marked autumn's arrival became increasingly elaborate as Russian territories expanded and agricultural productivity improved. These festivals provided opportunities for displaying the prosperity that resulted from effective governance, while offering thanksgiving for divine blessings that had ensured community survival for another year. Palace celebrations during harvest season often lasted for weeks and attracted visitors from distant territories. Winter observances combined practical preparations for surviving harsh weather with religious ceremonies that provided spiritual comfort during the most challenging season. Christmas celebrations developed into elaborate affairs that demonstrated royal wealth through generous hospitality, while reinforcing religious themes about divine protection and ultimate redemption from earthly suffering. Wedding ceremonies within royal families reflected both changing religious practices and evolving political relationships that shaped each historical period. Early Slavic marriage customs emphasized community celebration and family alliance building through rituals that could last for days and involved entire settlements in festivities that strengthened social bonds. The Christian marriage ceremonies that replaced pagan wedding customs after Vladimir's conversion introduced theological concepts about sacramental union while preserving traditional elements that connected new religious practices to ancestral customs. Royal weddings became increasingly elaborate political events that required coordination between religious authorities, diplomatic representatives, and family members whose relationships would be affected by the new alliance. Byzantine wedding traditions that entered Russian court culture through international marriages introduced ceremonial elements that elevated royal weddings to imperial status, while demonstrating cultural sophistication that impressed foreign observers. These elaborate rituals required extensive preparation and coordination that involved entire palace communities in creating spectacles worthy of sovereign dignity. Marriage negotiations that preceded royal weddings reveal the complex calculations that balance personal affection with political advantage, religious compatibility with diplomatic necessity, and family loyalty with dynastic ambition. The surviving correspondence regarding these arrangements provides intimate glimpses into how medieval families navigated between emotional desires and practical requirements. Funeral rites evolved dramatically across the medieval period as pagan burial customs gave way to Christian practices that emphasized spiritual salvation rather than earthly continuation. Early Slavic funeral ceremonies included elaborate grave goods and burial mounds that were intended to support deceased rulers in afterlife realms that resembled earthly kingdoms. Orthodox Christian funeral practices introduced theological concepts about bodily resurrection and spiritual judgment that required different ceremonial approaches, while preserving traditional elements that provided emotional comfort for grieving families. Royal funerals became increasingly elaborate demonstrations of dynastic continuity that reassured subjects about political stability while honouring deceased rulers' achievements. The mourning customs that followed royal deaths reflected both religious requirements and political necessities, as surviving family members balanced personal grief with governmental responsibilities that couldn't be interrupted even during periods of loss. Palace life during mourning periods adapted to restrictions that affected everything from daily meals to diplomatic ceremonies. Religious influences on royal customs extended beyond specific ceremonies to encompass daily practices that integrated spiritual observances into governmental routines. Morning prayers became standard beginnings for official activities. Evening vespers provided spiritual preparation for rest. Seasonal fasts affected palace dining and entertainment in ways that reinforced religious commitment while demonstrating royal piety to both subjects and foreign observers. Orthodox Christianity's liturgical calendar created regular rhythms that structured royal family life around religious observances while providing opportunities for demonstrating pious leadership. Major religious festivals required extensive preparations that involved entire palace communities in activities that combined spiritual devotion with practical administration. Folk traditions preserved within palace settings revealed the continuing influence of popular culture on aristocratic life, even as royal families developed increasingly sophisticated international connections. Traditional songs, dances, and storytelling customs persisted in royal entertainment even after courts adopted formal cultural practices borrowed from Byzantine and Western European traditions. The integration of folk elements into official court culture created distinctive Russian traditions that combined popular customs with aristocratic refinement in ways that distinguished Russian royal culture from both Byzantine and Western European models. These cultural syntheses preserved essential elements of national identity, while demonstrating cultural sophistication that supported diplomatic relationships with foreign powers. Seasonal food served in royal households reflected both agricultural realities and cultural preferences that connected palace dining to broader community traditions. Traditional Russian dishes remained important elements in royal cuisine, even as international influences introduced exotic ingredients and cooking techniques that demonstrated wealth and cultural sophistication. Religious dietary restrictions created opportunities for cultural creativity, as palace cooks developed elaborate preparations that met orthodox fasting requirements, while satisfying aristocratic expectations for luxurious dining. These culinary innovations contributed to distinctive Russian cooking traditions that combined religious observance with gastronomic excellence. Holiday gift-giving customs evolved from simple exchanges that reinforced social relationships to elaborate demonstrations of royal generosity that supported diplomatic relationships while rewarding loyal service. The presents that royal families exchanged during major celebrations reflected both personal affection and political calculation in ways that revealed the complex motivations underlying aristocratic social relationships. Children's participation in seasonal celebrations provided educational opportunities that taught young royals about religious traditions, family customs, and political relationships through experiential learning that complemented formal instruction. These celebratory activities created positive memories that strengthened family bonds while preparing children for their future roles as political and cultural leaders. The artistic productions that accompanied major celebrations, including musical compositions, theatrical performances, and decorative arts, contributed to cultural development that extended far beyond immediate entertainment value, caught patronage of artistic activities during festival seasons, supported creative communities while producing cultural achievements that enhanced royal prestige and national identity. The human stories behind the crown, the personal letters that survived the centuries of warfare, conquest, and political upheaval, provide intimate windows into the human hearts that beat beneath the ceremonial robes and golden crowns. These private documents reveal that Russian rulers, despite their extraordinary circumstances, experienced the same fundamental emotions, love, fear, hope, and sorrow, that have always defined human existence. Princess Olga's correspondence with Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII reveals a woman struggling to balance grief over her husband's murder with determination to protect her young son's inheritance. Her letters mix diplomatic formality with personal vulnerability in ways that chronicle accounts never captured. "My heart remains heavy with loss," she wrote, "yet my mind must stay clear for the decisions that will shape my people's future." The love letters exchanged between Prince Vladimir and his various wives before his Christian conversion show a ruler whose capacity for genuine affection coexisted with the political calculations that governed most aristocratic relationships. His note to Princess Ronida reveals unexpected tenderness. "When I return from campaign, your smile will be the light that guides me home through the darkness of political concerns that consume my days." Yaroslav the Wise's private journal, fragments of which survived in monastic archives, provides rare glimpses into the psychological pressures experienced by a ruler governing territories that stretched across a continent. "Each decision affects thousands of lives," he wrote during a particularly difficult period. "How does one carry such weight without losing either compassion or effectiveness? Some nights I lie awake wondering if wisdom is burden rather than blessing." The family quarrels that erupted during succession crises revealed how personal relationships could be poisoned by political ambition in ways that destroyed bonds formed during shared childhood experiences. Brothers who had played together as children, learned from the same tutors, and shared family meals found themselves commanding armies against each other when inheritance disputes arose. Dmitry Donskoy's letter to his wife before the Battle of Kulikovo provides extraordinary insight into the mind of a leader, preparing for a confrontation that could determine his nation's destiny. "My beloved, if God wills that I should not return, remember that love for you and our children gave me courage to risk everything for their freedom. Teach our sons that some causes are worth any sacrifice." The psychological burden of rulership weighed differently on each individual who assumed the throne, but certain patterns emerge from the personal accounts that survived. The isolation that accompanied supreme authority affected even the strongest personalities. Ivan the Great's private notes reveal a ruler who understood that his decisions would influence millions of people, yet who had no peers with whom he could share the emotional weight of such responsibility. Mental illness within royal families created challenges that were poorly understood by medieval medicine, but profoundly affected both individual rulers and the kingdoms they governed. The depression that apparently affected several Rurikid princes manifested in different ways. Some became reclusive and indecisive, while others compensated through increased military activity or religious devotion that bordered on obsession. Love stories within royal families provide some of the most touching personal accounts that survived from the medieval period. The genuine affection that developed between some arranged marriages created relationships that sustained couples through political crises and personal tragedies. Ivan III's devotion to Sophia Paleolog, despite the political origins of their union, demonstrates how diplomatic marriages could evolve into partnerships based on mutual respect and emotional intimacy. Personal tragedies struck royal families with the same randomness that affected ordinary people, but with consequences that extended far beyond immediate family circles. The deaths of young princes and princesses from disease, accidents, or violence created succession crises, while devastating parents who experienced grief as profound as any felt by common families losing children. The relationship between fathers and sons within royal dynasties reflected both universal family dynamics and the unique pressures created by succession expectations. Some princes developed close relationships with their heirs, sharing knowledge and responsibility in ways that prepared younger generations for leadership, while providing emotional satisfaction for aging rulers. Other father-son relationships were poisoned by competition and mistrust that reflected the dangerous realities of dynastic politics. Sibling relationships within royal families range from devoted loyalty that survived every political challenge to bitter rivalry that destroyed family bonds and sometimes entire kingdoms. The cooperation between Alexander Nevsky and his brothers during the Mongol period contrasts sharply with the civil wars that tore apart Yaroslav the Wise's sons when they competed for territorial control. Women's experiences within royal households varied enormously depending on individual personality, historical circumstances, and the cultural expectations of specific periods. Some princesses and queens exercised significant political influence, while others remained confined to traditional domestic roles. The personal accounts that survive reveal that many royal women found creative ways to influence political decisions through informal relationships and behind-the-scenes negotiations. Religious faith provided psychological framework that helped many rulers cope with the moral complexities and emotional pressures of leadership. Personal prayer books and religious correspondence reveal the spiritual struggles of individuals trying to reconcile Christian teachings about mercy and forgiveness with political necessities that sometimes required violence and ruthless decision-making. The friendships that some rulers developed with advisors, clergy, or foreign diplomats provided emotional support that helped counterbalance the isolation that accompanied supreme authority. These personal relationships, when they transcended purely political considerations, offered opportunities for honest communication and genuine human connection that were otherwise rare in royal environments. Parental love within royal families created some of the most poignant personal accounts that survived from the medieval period. Letters from parents to children reveal the universal concerns about health, education, and future happiness that transcended the extraordinary circumstances of royal life. These intimate documents demonstrate that love remained constant, even when political pressures threatened to destroy family relationships. The legacy of these medieval rulers extends far beyond their political achievements or territorial conquests to encompass the human example they provided for subsequent generations. Their personal struggles with power, responsibility, family relationships, and spiritual questions created precedents and patterns that influenced Russian cultural development in ways that persisted long after their specific political systems had been replaced. The psychological profiles that emerge from personal documents reveal that effective leadership required not just political skill or military courage, but also emotional resilience and moral flexibility that enabled individuals to function under extraordinary pressure while maintaining enough humanity to inspire loyalty and respect from subjects who needed to believe. Their rulers understood and cared about their welfare. These intimate human stories behind the crown remind us that history was created by real people who experienced joy and sorrow, success and failure, love and loss in ways that connected them to the universal human experience, even as they shaped the destiny of nations. Their personal struggles and achievements continue to resonate because they reveal the enduring truth that great events result from individual human choices made by people who face the same fundamental challenges that confront every human generation. The legacy of medieval Russia, as dawn approaches and our long journey through medieval Russia draws to its peaceful close, we find ourselves back where we began, beside the great rivers that carried the dreams of 1,000 years toward their destiny as a mighty empire. The wooden halls of early Novgorod had grown into the stone palaces of Ivan the Great's Moscow, but the human heart that beat within each ruler remained fundamentally unchanged. From Rurik's arrival in 862 to Ivan III's death in 1505, we have witnessed the extraordinary transformation of scattered Slavic tribes into the unified Russian state that would eventually span 11 time zones and shape world history. This medieval foundation created not just political institutions but cultural identity, religious traditions, and national character that would endure through centuries of further change and challenge. The personal stories we have shared reveal that behind every great historical moment lived real people who struggled with the same fundamental questions that face every human generation. How do we balance personal desires with family obligations? How do we maintain hope during periods of crisis? How do we preserve what we love while adapting to circumstances beyond our control? Princess Olga's fierce love for her murdered husband and young son motivated revenge that became legend. Yaroslav the Wise's patient scholarship created legal foundations that survived centuries of political upheaval. Dmitry Donskoy's courage at Kulikovo proved that seemingly impossible dreams could become reality through determination and faith. Ivan the Great's diplomatic brilliance achieved independence without the devastating warfare that had marked earlier struggles. These medieval rulers left behind more than territorial conquests or administrative innovations. They demonstrated that human dignity could survive foreign domination, that cultural identity could persist through periods of profound change, and that individual courage could alter the course of history when circumstances demanded extraordinary responses to extraordinary challenges. The rivers still flow through the Russian lands, carrying the memories of all who lived and died along their banks. The forests still whisper the names of princes and princesses who found both refuge and inspiration in their depths. The bells still ring in Orthodox churches, preserving the faith that provided spiritual foundation for a civilization that emerged from tribal settlements to become one of the world's great powers. As you drift towards sleep, remember that you have walked with giants who shaped the destiny of nations while remaining fundamentally human in their hopes, fears, and dreams. Their legacy continues in the enduring truth that ordinary people, when called upon by history, can accomplish extraordinary things through courage, wisdom, and faith in the ultimate triumph of human dignity over every earthly challenge. The medieval Russia that began beside forest rivers had fulfilled its destiny as a great empire, but its most important legacy was the demonstration that the human spirit cannot be permanently conquered by any earthly force. This lesson, learned through centuries of struggle and triumph, remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago in the wooden halls where our story began. Sleep well, knowing that courage and hope have triumphed before and will triumph again, as surely as the rivers flow toward the sea and the seasons turn towards spring.